Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been debating for months whether to share this story. It's not something I talk about casually, and most people who hear bits and pieces think I'm exaggerating or making it up. But I need to get this off my chest, and if anyone might understand, it's people here who've had similar experiences. My grandfather was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest. He knew every trail, creek, and mountain pass, from the Cascades to the Blues. He wasn't the type to tell tall tales. He was practical, straightforward, and respected nature more than anything. Growing up, I spent every summer with him, learning how to track, hunt, and respect the wilderness. It was late October 1996 when this happened. I was 17 and had been begging him to take me to a remote area in Washington State where he used to hunt as a young man. He was reluctant at first, mentioning something about that place changing and how he hadn't been back there since the 60s. Eventually, he agreed, but I noticed him packing extra supplies and being unusually quiet during the drive. We arrived at the trailhead around noon. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with fall colors, deep reds, burnt oranges, and yellows that seemed to glow against the evergreens. Grandpa moved slower than usual, scanning the tree line frequently. I figured he was just being cautious about bears since it was fall. "Stay close," he kept saying, "and listen more than you look. The forest tells you things your eyes can miss." We hiked for about 3 hours, following a barely visible trail that seemed to exist only in my grandfather's memory. The terrain was challenging, steep in places with fallen trees and rocky outcrops. Eventually, we reached a small clearing nestled between two ridges. A meadow stretched out before us, maybe 200 yards across, with tall grass swaying in the light breeze. "This is it," Grandpa said, his voice different somehow. "This is where it happened." I remember feeling confused. What happened? He set down his pack and sat on a fallen log at the edge of the trees. For a few minutes, he just stared across the meadow like he was searching for something. Then he started telling me about the fall of 1967. "I was hunting alone," he said, "right here, almost exactly where we're sitting now. It was just before sunset, like now." The way he described it, he'd been waiting for deer to emerge into the meadow when he heard something moving through the underbrush, something big that wasn't crashing around like a bear or deer would. The footsteps were deliberate, spaced like a person's, but heavier. As Grandpa told the story, I noticed his hands trembling slightly. This man who'd fought in Korea, who'd survived 60 years in the wilderness, who I'd never seen afraid of anything, was shaking. "It just walked out," he said, pointing to the far side of the meadow. "Stood there, tall as a doorway, looking across at me." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. The way he described the creature, broad-chested, covered in reddish-brown hair, standing fully upright. I knew what he was talking about, but I didn't want to say the word. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, we all heard the stories, but they were just that, stories. Did it come toward you?" I asked. Grandpa shook his head. "No, that's what was strangest. It just stood there, watching me. And I watched it. Must have been 3-4 minutes we just looked at each other." He described the eyes, dark, set deep under a prominent brow, but alive with something more than animal intelligence. "Not human," he said, "but not just animal either. There was something old in those eyes, something that knew things." As he spoke, the sun was beginning to set behind the western ridge. Long shadows stretched across the meadow, and the breeze had died down, leaving an unusual stillness. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No birds, no insects chirping. Maybe we should head back, I suggested, suddenly uncomfortable. Grandpa didn't seem to hear me. He was staring intently at the far tree line. "Just like this," he whispered. "The light was just like this." I followed his gaze but saw nothing except shadows and trees. He continued his story, describing how the creature had eventually turned and walked back into the forest with a smooth, natural gait that defied explanation. "Not like a man in a suit," he emphasized. "Nothing like that. Moved like it belonged here more than I did." Just as he finished speaking, I heard it, a crack of a branch from somewhere across the meadow. My head snapped up, eyes scanning the darkening tree line. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Grandpa nodded slowly, his expression unnervingly calm. "Don't move," he said softly. "Just watch." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The shadows at the far edge of the meadow seemed to deepen, shift. For several minutes we sat in complete silence, hardly breathing. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was just a shadow or a trick of the fading light, but then it moved, stepping partially out from the tree line. Even at that distance, maybe 150 yards, I could tell it was massive. It stood upright, its shoulders impossibly broad, its head set directly on those shoulders with almost no visible neck. The dying sunlight caught its fur, a deep reddish-brown color that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice catching. "I see it," he replied, not taking his eyes off the figure. "Don't move. Don't run." The creature took another step into the clearing, and I got a better look at it. It must have been at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered entirely in that reddish-brown hair. Its arms hung longer than a human's would, but it stood completely upright, not hunched or stooped like a bear. What happened next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. It turned its head and looked directly at us. Even across that distance, I could feel those eyes lock onto mine. Not like when an animal looks at you. This was deliberate, focused. I couldn't see the details of its face clearly, but I could feel the weight of that gaze. My entire body went cold. It wasn't fear exactly, though I was terrified. It was something deeper, a recognition that I was in the presence of something that didn't fit into my understanding of the world. Something ancient, something that had been walking these forests long before humans came. Grandpa placed his hand on my arm, a gentle pressure telling me to stay still. I couldn't have moved if I wanted to. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, we stared at each other across that meadow, me, my grandfather, and this impossible creature that shouldn't exist. Then, with a fluidity that seemed unnatural for something so large, it simply turned and walked back into the forest. No rushing, no crashing through underbrush. Just a smooth, purposeful movement that took it from our sight. The moment it disappeared, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My legs were shaking so badly I had to sit down. What was that?" I asked, though I knew. We both knew. Grandpa didn't answer immediately. He was still staring at the spot where the creature had vanished, a strange expression on his face. Not fear, but something like reverence mixed with awe. "Same one," he finally said. "Has to be. Same place, same way it moved. After all these years." "You think it's the same individual?" I asked, trying to process what that would mean. He nodded. "They live long, I reckon, and they remember." We didn't leave immediately. Grandpa insisted we sit quietly for a while longer, partly to make sure it was truly gone, partly out of respect. As we sat there, he told me more about his encounter in 1967, filling in details he'd never shared before. He described how, after the creature had left that day, he'd found massive footprints in the soft earth near the creek, how he'd followed them for a short distance before they disappeared on rocky ground, how he'd come back the next day with a camera but found the prints washed away by overnight rain. "I never told anybody but your grandmother," he said. "Who'd believe it? And besides..." He paused, searching for words. It didn't feel right somehow, like it was something private between me and whatever that was. As darkness began to fall in earnest, we finally packed up and began the hike back. Every shadow, every rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. But Grandpa seemed calmer than I'd seen him all day, like some long-standing question had been answered. We made it back to the truck well after dark, using flashlights for the last mile. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist in the rational, modern world. In the years since, I've tried to make sense of what happened that day. I've read the scientific explanations, the skeptical takes, the folklore. None of it quite captures what we experienced. It wasn't just seeing a creature that wasn't supposed to exist. It was the feeling that came with it, the absolute certainty that we were the intruders, not it. The strange, almost spiritual weight of meeting something that seemed to exist outside of time as we understand it. Grandpa passed away 3 years ago. In his final months, when his mind sometimes wandered, he'd occasionally mention those eyes in the meadow. Even confused by medication and illness, that memory remained crystal clear for him. I've never gone back to that specific location. Part of me wants to, desperately. Part of me knows better. Whatever lives in those mountains doesn't want to be found, doesn't need to be documented or studied or proven real. I still hike and camp throughout Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. But I do it differently now, more quietly, more respectfully. And I never quite shake the feeling that I'm being watched from just beyond the tree line. Sometimes when I'm alone in the wilderness and the wind moves through a meadow of tall grass, I remember the weight of that gaze across the clearing. I remember how it felt to stand in the presence of something older than human memory, something that belonged to the land in a way we never will. And I understand why my grandfather kept his silence for so many years. Some things are better left undisturbed. Some encounters aren't meant to be proven or explained away. They're just meant to remind us that the world is older and stranger than we can imagine. Story 2. The thing that crossed Highway 14. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or things that go bump in the night. My husband John and I have always been practical people. He worked for the forestry department for 30 years, and I taught elementary school in North Bonneville until I retired. We're the last people you'd expect to get caught up in something unexplainable. But what happened that day in March of 1969 changed how I see the world forever. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday evening. John answered, and I could tell something was off by the way his expression changed. He kept saying things like, "Slow down," and "Are you sure about this?" When he hung up, he looked at me with this strange expression. "That was Don Cox," he said. "You remember him from the community council meetings?" I did. Don was a reliable guy who drove a delivery truck for the lumber company. Quiet type, never exaggerated, never drank much. The serious, straightforward kind of man who wouldn't call someone up with wild stories. "He found something up by Bear Creek," John continued. "Footprints. Says they're like nothing he's ever seen before. But that's not all. He saw something on Highway 14 a couple days ago. Wants to show us where it happened." I remember thinking it was probably just a bear. We get them sometimes, especially up by Bear Creek where the forest gets dense. But John seemed troubled, so I agreed to go with him to meet Don the next morning. We picked Don up around 9. Right away I noticed he looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. His face was drawn, and his hands kept fidgeting with his hat. He climbed into our back seat without much of a greeting, just a nod and a quiet thanks. As we drove toward Beacon Rock on Highway 14, Don was mostly silent. I kept glancing back at him in the rearview mirror, watching him stare out the window like he was expecting to see something emerge from the trees at any moment. Finally, as we got closer to Beacon Rock, He leaned forward between the front seats. "Slow down here," he said. His voice sounded different, strained somehow. It was right around this bend coming up. John eased off the gas as we approached the curve. The road here hugs the base of a steep hillside on the right, with a drop-off toward the Columbia River on the left. It was a clear day, sunny, but I remember thinking how different it would look in the foggy pre-dawn hours. "There," Don said suddenly, pointing toward a section of road ahead. "Pull over if you can." John found a small turnout and stopped the car. For a moment, none of us moved. I was looking out at an ordinary stretch of highway, trees rising up a steep embankment on one side. Nothing special, nothing that would explain the haunted look on Don's face. "It was the early morning of March 5th, Don finally said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "About 4:30 in the morning. I was heading east to make a delivery in Hood River. There was fog everywhere, one of those heavy blankets where you can barely see 20 feet ahead. I turned in my seat to look at him directly. His eyes weren't focused on us, but seemed fixed on some point in his memory. I came around that bend there, and my headlights caught something in the road. At first, I thought it was a tree trunk that had fallen. Something big and dark right in the middle of the asphalt." Don took a deep breath, and I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. But then it moved. It was walking across the road. Just walking, not hurrying, not running, like it had every right to be there. "What exactly did you see, Don?" John asked quietly. Don's eyes finally focused on us. "Something that shouldn't exist," he said. "It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more, walking on 2 legs, but it wasn't a man, covered in dark hair from head to foot, broad across the shoulders, thick through the chest, built like a linebacker, but bigger." I felt a chill run through me despite the warm car. The way Don described it, there was no embellishment, no dramatic flair, just simple, direct observations delivered in a voice that couldn't quite hide its fear. "I slowed down," Don continued, "not because I wanted a better look, but because I was too shocked to do anything else. It turned its head toward my truck, just turned and looked right at me. I can't describe the face well. It was dark and the fog didn't help, but I saw eyes reflecting in my headlights." John shifted in his seat. "How close did you get to it?" "Maybe 30 feet before it moved off the road. That's when—" Don's voice caught, and he had to clear his throat. "That's when it went up there." He pointed to the steep embankment on our right. I looked up at what appeared to be an almost vertical slope of rock and earth, rising about 20 feet before hitting a small ledge, then continuing up into the tree line. It reached the base of that slope, and then it just jumped. One leap, and it was up on that first ledge, must be 14 feet up at least. Did it like it was nothing, like stepping up on a curb. Then it was gone into the trees. The 3 of us sat in silence for a moment. I was trying to process what Don was saying. A creature that size, making a vertical leap like that. It didn't seem possible. "Let's get out and look," John finally said. The moment we stepped out of the car, I felt it. A heaviness in the air that hadn't been there on previous drives through this area. Maybe it was just suggestion, my mind playing tricks after Don's story. But it felt like the difference between an empty house and one where someone is quietly watching you from another room. Don stayed close to us as we walked to the base of the embankment. He kept looking up at the tree line, then back over his shoulder toward the road. His nervousness was contagious, and I found myself doing the same thing, scanning the trees above us, feeling exposed. The slope was even steeper up close. Standing at the bottom looking up, it seemed impossible that anything could scale it in a single bound. The surface was mostly loose shale and dirt with sparse vegetation grabbing hold where it could. I tried to imagine the scene Don had described, headlights cutting through fog, illuminating something massive and unknown crossing the highway. That's when it really hit me. The true terror wasn't just in Don's description of some cryptid creature. It was the complete disruption of reality as I understood it. If what Don saw was real, and looking at his face, I couldn't doubt him, then the world was not what I thought it was. "I keep thinking about how it didn't run," Don said quietly beside me. "That's what gets me. A bear or a deer, they panic in headlights. This thing, it just looked at me and walked away, wasn't afraid at all." John was examining the base of the slope, running his hand over the ground like he might find evidence 2 weeks later. "You said you found footprints up at Bear Creek?" he asked. Don nodded. "That's why I called you. After this happened, I couldn't just go back to normal. I started looking around places where there wouldn't be many people. Found a set of tracks by the creek 3 days ago. They're huge, John. 18 inches at least, and deep. Whatever made them is heavy. I wanted to suggest we go see these footprints, but something held me back. Standing there at the base of that impossible slope, I felt a growing certainty that I didn't want to know more. Some knowledge isn't meant for us." "Has anyone else reported seeing anything?" I asked instead. Don shook his head. "Who would I tell? The sheriff? They'd think I was drunk or crazy. That's why I called you two. John knows these forests. I figured if anyone would believe me." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I understood completely why he'd reached out to us. He wasn't looking for publicity or attention. He just needed someone else to know, to share the burden of what he'd seen. We stood there for maybe 20 minutes total, but it felt much longer. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest above us seemed too quiet, the air too still. When a truck rumbled past on the highway behind us, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Don kept staring up at that ledge 14 feet above us. "It shouldn't have been able to do that," he said, almost to himself. "Nothing that big should move like that." Finally, John suggested we head back to the car. As we walked, I found myself scanning the ground for any sign of huge footprints, even though I knew the highway shoulder was too rocky and compacted to show tracks. Back in the car, Don seemed both relieved to be leaving and reluctant to go. He kept looking back at the spot as we pulled away. "I drive this route 4 times a week," he said. "Have been for 11 years. Never seen anything like that before. Now I can't stop looking for it every time I pass this stretch. Can barely focus on the road." We offered to take Don to get lunch in Stevenson, but he declined. He just wanted to go home. As we drove in silence, I kept thinking about what it would be like to be alone in a truck in the pre-dawn hours, fog all around, and suddenly have your headlights fall on something that shouldn't exist. When we dropped Don off at his house, he paused before getting out of the car. "I'm not crazy," he said, like he needed to convince himself as much as us. "I know what I saw. And whatever it was, it saw me too." John and I didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? Either Don had experienced some kind of hallucination, which seemed unlikely given the kind of steady, rational person he'd always been, or there was something in the forests of Skamania County that defied explanation. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing it, the fog, the dark road, headlights illuminating a massive fur-covered figure calmly crossing the asphalt, the casual power of a 14-foot vertical leap. But mostly, I kept thinking about those eyes that Don said had reflected in his headlights. Eyes that looked back at him. Eyes that belonged to something that wasn't afraid of humans or their machines. John and I never did go to see those footprints at Bear Creek. Something about that day by the highway had scared us both more deeply than we wanted to admit. The fear wasn't about physical danger. It was the fear that comes from having your understanding of reality challenged. Some beliefs are foundational, and when they're shaken, everything else becomes uncertain. In the weeks that followed, I found myself looking up information at the library about similar sightings in the Pacific Northwest. There were more than I expected. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but after standing on that roadside with Don, hearing the tremor in his voice, I wasn't so quick to dismiss them anymore. Don moved away from North Bonneville about 6 months later. He never talked publicly about what he saw, as far as I know. We lost touch after he left. Sometimes when John and I drive Highway 14 past Beacon Rock, we both fall silent as we pass that particular stretch of road. I still scan the tree line, half expecting to see something large moving through the forest. And I still feel that heaviness in the air, that sense of being in a place where the impossible once crossed paths with the ordinary. I don't know what Don Cox saw in the fog that March morning in 1969. I don't know what made those footprints by Bear Creek. But I know that standing there, looking up at that steep embankment, something fundamental changed in how I see the world. The forests of the Pacific Northwest are ancient. They hold secrets in their shadows, things that have perhaps lived alongside us for centuries, rarely seen, but always present. Things that can cross a highway in the pre-dawn fog, leap up an impossible slope, and vanish into trees that have stood for hundreds of years before any road was built. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. I'm not sure I would if I hadn't stood there myself, seen the fear in Don's eyes, felt that strange heaviness in the air. But I know what I experienced, and it stayed with me all these years. Some things can't be explained away. Some moments change you forever. And sometimes the impossible walks right in front of your headlights on a foggy morning, looks back at you, and disappears up a steep embankment as if to say, "You don't know everything. You never did." Story 3. Number sign footprints in the fog, what found us near North Bonneville. I've never told this story publicly before. For the longest time, I couldn't even bring myself to talk about it with the 3 friends who were there with me that night. We've had a sort of unspoken agreement to just not discuss it. But it's been almost 7 years now, and I still wake up sometimes with my heart racing. The image of those footprints burned into my memory. I need to get this off my chest. It happened in late October, about 20 miles outside of North Bonneville. Me and 3 of my buddies were on a weekend hunting trip. We'd spent the day scouting locations for the next morning's hunt, and were heading back to our cabin as dusk was setting in. The 4 of us were packed into my old Ford F-250, not exactly comfortable, but reliable on those backwoods roads. The weather had been clear most of the day, but as evening approached, this fog started rolling in. Not just your normal fog, but the kind that seems to swallow everything. The kind where your headlights just hit a wall of white and bounce back at you. We were on a Forest Service road I'd driven dozens of times before, but with the visibility so bad, I missed our usual turn. By the time I realized my mistake, we were on an unfamiliar dirt road that wasn't on any of our maps. The truck's headlights barely cut through the mist, maybe 15 feet ahead at most. The road had narrowed significantly, with thick woods pressing in on both sides. I remember thinking we should just turn around, but there was no good place to do it without risking getting stuck in a ditch. "Let's check if this road connects back to the main one," my buddy in the passenger seat suggested. It seemed reasonable. These service roads often loop around, and we figured we couldn't be more than a mile or 2 from familiar territory. So I killed the engine, and we all climbed out of the truck. The silence hit me immediately. If you've ever been deep in the woods on a foggy night, you know what I'm talking about. It's not just quiet. It's like sound itself stops existing. No wind rustling the trees, no night birds, not even insects. Just 4 guys standing in a pool of headlight glow that faded into solid white a few yards away. The air felt heavy and damp against my skin, and I could see our breath in front of our faces. The temperature had dropped significantly since sunset. We all had flashlights, but they were almost useless in the fog, just created these weird, ghostly halos that didn't illuminate much of anything. "Let's walk ahead a bit and see where this goes," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. There was something about the stillness that made me uneasy, but I couldn't explain why. It was just a foggy night in the woods, nothing we hadn't experienced before. We started walking, staying close together in a loose line. Our boots made squelching sounds in the muddy road, which was still soft from recent rain. I checked my watch, 9:47 p.m. The plan was to walk for maybe 10 minutes. If we didn't find a connection to the main road by then, we'd head back and figure out how to turn the truck around. We'd gone maybe a quarter mile, about 5 minutes of walking, when we heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, small rocks or pebbles tumbling down, then more, like a mini avalanche of loose stones cascading down the slope to our right. We all froze, instinctively huddling closer together. Probably just a deer, someone whispered, but it didn't sound like a deer. Whatever dislodged those rocks was heavy, much heavier than a deer. And the strange thing was, there was no accompanying sound of movement, no crashing through underbrush, no snapping twigs, just the rocks. "Let's head back to the truck," I said, and no one argued. We turned around and started walking quickly, flashlight beams bouncing wildly as we moved. Nobody wanted to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Something was up there on that slope watching us. That's when one of my friends stopped suddenly, causing me to bump into him. "What the hell?" he said, pointing his flashlight at the ground. There in the soft mud of the road were footprints, huge footprints, and they hadn't been there 5 minutes ago when we'd walked this exact same stretch of road. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We'd been the only ones on this road. The only tracks should have been our own boot prints heading away from the truck. But these were something else entirely. They came down from the slope where we'd heard the rocks falling, crossed the road, and continued into the woods on the other side. The stride length between them was massive, easily over 4 feet or 1.2 meters, and the prints themselves were enormous. I wear a size 12 boot, pretty big by most standards. Standing next to one of these prints, I placed my boot inside it. My foot looked like a child's by comparison. There was at least 2 inches of space on all sides. "This is fresh," another friend whispered, crouching down to examine the mud. "Still filling with water." That's when the full realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever made these prints had crossed the road behind us after we'd already passed. It had been following us. And judging by the size and depth of the impressions, it was massive. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that before. It wasn't the quick adrenaline spike of being startled. It was a deep, primal dread that seemed to seep into my bones. Because in that moment, standing in the fog with those impossible footprints, I understood that we were not alone on this road, and whatever was with us wasn't human. Back to the truck. "Now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't run. Something told me running would be the worst thing we could do. But we walked fast, flashlights pointed at the ground, following our own boot prints back the way we'd come. Nobody spoke. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out even the sound of our footsteps. It felt like the longest walk of my life. Every few seconds I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something looming in the fog behind us. But there was nothing, just the impenetrable white wall closing in a few yards back. When we finally reached the truck, I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The others piled in, slamming their doors shut like they were sealing an airlock. I started the engine, put it in reverse, and began the awkward process of turning around on the narrow road. That meant backing up slowly, inching the rear end of the truck around while watching through the side mirrors and rear window. And that's when I saw it. As I was backing up, looking through the rear window, a dark shape moved in the fog about 50 feet behind us. At first it was just a shadow, a deeper density in the mist, but then it moved again, and I could make out its silhouette against the white background. It was tall, much taller than a man, maybe 7 or 8 feet at least, broad across the shoulders, standing fully upright, not hunched over like a bear would be. The outlines of long arms were visible, swinging with a strange, fluid grace that seemed at odds with its size. I froze, one hand on the wheel, the other on the seat behind me for the reverse maneuver. I couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. Then it turned its head. I couldn't see its face clearly through the fog, but I knew. I absolutely knew. It was looking directly at the truck, at me. And the way it moved wasn't like an animal startled by headlights. It was deliberate, calculating, like it was assessing us. For a few seconds that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other through the fog and the rear window. My friends hadn't noticed yet. They were facing forward, urging me to hurry up with the turn. Then, with the same eerie calmness, the figure simply walked off the road and disappeared into the trees. No rushing, no hurry. Just a purposeful stride that took it out of our sight within seconds. I completed the turn in record time, put the truck in drive, and got us out of there as fast as I safely could on that muddy, unfamiliar road. No one asked why I was suddenly in such a rush. They must have felt it too, the overwhelming need to be somewhere else, anywhere else. For the first few miles, no one spoke. Each of us was processing what had happened in our own way. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure emerging from the fog behind us, but there was nothing. Finally, one of my friends broke the silence. "Did you guys see those footprints?" What followed was a fragmented, nervous conversation where we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was an unusually large bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe it was some kind of prank. Maybe the fog and darkness had played tricks on our perception, making ordinary tracks seem larger than they were. But we all knew better. Bears don't leave prints like that. No human could fake those stride lengths in soft mud. And what I'd seen moving in the fog, that wasn't someone in a costume. I didn't tell them about the figure I'd spotted while turning the truck around. Somehow, putting that into words made it too real, too terrifying. And I think part of me was afraid they wouldn't believe me. Or worse, that they would. We made it back to our cabin, but none of us slept well that night. The next morning, there was an unspoken agreement to cut our trip short. We packed up and headed home, making excuses about bad weather and poor hunting conditions. None of us mentioned what had really happened. In the years since, I've done a lot of research. I've read accounts from other people who've had similar experiences in the Pacific Northwest. I've looked at plaster casts of footprints that match what we saw that night. I've studied the history of North Bonneville and the surrounding wilderness areas, learning about decades of unexplained sightings and encounters. Some people might jump to the obvious conclusion: Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I don't know what label to put on what we encountered. I just know what I saw, what we all saw in those footprints. Something not human, not quite animal either. Something that moved with an intelligence that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. What stays with me most isn't just the size of those tracks, or even the silhouette I glimpsed in the fog. It's the behavior. The way it crossed behind us so silently that we wouldn't have known it was there, if not for those few dislodged rocks. The way it seemed to observe us with a calculated interest. The way it vanished into the woods with such ease, despite its size. Whatever was on that road with us that night knew exactly what it was doing. It wasn't random. It wasn't just an animal crossing paths with humans by accident. It was deliberate. I still go hunting. I still spend time in the woods, but never alone, and never on foggy nights. And whenever I'm near North Bonneville, I find myself scanning the tree lines, the slopes above the road, looking for movement that doesn't belong. I know it's out there, walking those same woods, leaving those same massive prints in soft earth, moving through the forest with that same terrible silence. Maybe it's watching even now, waiting for another group of lost travelers to step out of their vehicle on a foggy night, not realizing what waits just beyond the reach of their headlights. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed on that road a little longer, if we'd followed those tracks instead of retreating to the truck. Or worse, what might have happened if we hadn't heard those rocks falling, our only warning that something was there. I don't have nightmares about it anymore, not exactly, but sometimes when the fog rolls in thick around my house, I find myself checking the locks twice. And when I hear stones shifting outside in the dark, I don't look out the window. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some knowledge once gained stays with you forever, whether you want it to or not. Story 4. The figure on the service road. I've debated sharing this for a long time. It happened in the summer of 2003, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My wife and I were taking a weekend drive through the back roads near Iron Creek Campground. We weren't camping or anything specific, just one of those lazy Sunday afternoons where you get in the car and drive, enjoying being away from the city. We had our old Mazda 626 back then. Not the most rugged vehicle for forest roads, but it handled well enough on the maintained service roads. It was low to the ground though, which becomes important later in this story. It was around 4 in the afternoon, perfect weather, clear skies, sun still high enough to light everything clearly. We'd been driving for maybe an hour, taking random turns, not really paying attention to where we were going. That's something we used to do a lot, just explore. After that day, we don't anymore. We were on a winding service road that gradually climbed uphill. Not steep, but enough that the engine worked a little harder. Trees lined both sides, mostly pine and fir, creating that tunnel effect where the branches almost meet overhead in places. You know that feeling when you're driving through thick forest and everything feels a little enclosed, like that. As we came around a bend, I noticed we were approaching what looked like a fork in the road. The main service road continued straight ahead, but there was a smaller extraction road branching off to the left, one of those narrower dirt tracks logging companies use to get equipment deeper into the forest. That's when I saw it. About 20 to 25 meters ahead of the fork, standing directly in the middle of that side road, was a figure. My first thought was, that's a really tall person. But something immediately felt wrong about that assessment. It was standing completely still, facing the main road, facing us. Even from that distance, I could tell it was huge. At least 6.5 to 7 feet tall, around 2 to 2.1 meters. Its body was almost entirely black, not brown, not dark gray, but a deep black that stood out sharply against the lighter dirt road and green forest background. What struck me most was its posture. It wasn't doing anything threatening. It wasn't waving arms or moving toward us. It was just standing there, perfectly upright, broad shoulders, thick torso, almost like it was listening to our car approach. There was something about its stillness that was more unsettling than if it had been moving aggressively. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I remember distinctly thinking, don't slow down, don't stop. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like an instinct that bubbled up from somewhere primal. Something inside me knew that stopping would be a very bad idea. I maintained our speed, not accelerating dramatically, but definitely not slowing down either. As we got closer, maybe 15 meters away, I could see it more clearly. The sunlight was good, no shadows or tricks of light that might distort perception. This was solid daylight viewing conditions, and what I saw made my mouth go dry. The figure was covered in what looked like short, dense hair or fur, not clothing. There were no lines where garments would separate, no shine of nylon or fabric. Just a solid mass of dark something. Its proportions were all wrong for a human. The shoulders too wide and squared off, the arms hanging longer than they should, the neck almost non-existent, so the head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders. As we passed the fork, now maybe only 10 meters from the figure, I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. The thing hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to our approach at all, just stood there, oriented toward us, in a posture that suggested it was fully aware of our presence, but completely unbothered by it. My wife was looking down at a map as we passed the fork, completely oblivious to what was happening. I didn't alert her. I don't know why. Maybe I was in shock, or maybe I didn't want to frighten her, or maybe part of me was afraid that drawing attention to it might somehow provoke a reaction. We drove past, and I watched in the side mirror as the figure remained motionless. It didn't turn to follow our progress, didn't step toward the main road, didn't make any movement at all that I could detect. It just stood there in the middle of that logging road like some kind of sentinel. Once we were about 50 meters past, my wife must have noticed my tension. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." That's when I told her. I described what I'd just seen standing on that side road. As I spoke, I kept checking the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the figure emerge onto the main road behind us. She turned in her seat, looking back, but by then we'd gone around another bend, and the fork was no longer visible. She asked if I wanted to go back and check it out. "Absolutely not," I said, probably more forcefully than necessary. The thought of turning around, of approaching that thing again, made my skin crawl. And now that I'd had a moment to process what I'd seen, another realization hit me. Our Mazda sat very low to the ground. If we had stopped, if that thing had approached us and turned out to be hostile, we wouldn't have been able to off-road to escape. We'd have been stuck on that narrow service road with no way around it. We drove in silence for a while after that. My wife didn't dismiss what I'd seen, but I could tell she wasn't sure what to make of it either. The more I described the figure, its unnatural stillness, its odd proportions, the way it just stood there listening to our approach, the more unsettled she became. Could it have been a bear? She suggested, but there was doubt in her voice. It wasn't a bear. I've seen plenty of bears in the wild, including black bears standing on their hind legs. This wasn't that. Bears have a distinct shape, rounded shoulders, a visible snout, proportions that are unmistakably ursine even when they're upright. This had a different silhouette entirely, more humanoid, but wrong in ways that are hard to articulate. The shoulders were too square, too structural. The head shape was wrong, and bears don't just stand perfectly still in the middle of a road watching vehicles approach. Maybe someone in a ghillie suit? She tried again, but that didn't fit either. Hunters use ghillie suits for camouflage, to blend in with surroundings. They don't stand exposed in the middle of open roads. And the solid mass of this thing, its size and proportions, didn't match a human in a costume. There was a density to it, a physical presence that felt organic and real. We eventually made our way back to more populated areas, and as civilization returned, the encounter started to feel more distant, more dreamlike. But I couldn't shake the image from my mind. That tall, dark figure, standing motionless, radiating what I can only describe as patient observation. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my head, questioning what I'd seen. Was it really as tall as I thought? Was it actually covered in fur, or was that some kind of clothing my mind couldn't process? Why didn't it move or react as we passed? The next day, I went online and started researching. I looked up wildlife in the Iron Creek area, thinking maybe there was some explanation, some known animal that could account for what I'd seen. Instead, I found forum posts and articles about other sightings in the Pacific Northwest. People describing tall, dark figures in the forests. Hikers and campers reporting feelings of being watched. Unusually large footprints found on remote trails. I had never given much credence to Bigfoot stories before. They seemed like folklore, campfire tales to spook friends. But now I found myself reading every account I could find, looking for similarities to my experience. And there were many. The height, the coloration, the unsettling stillness, the sense of intelligence behind the encounter. One detail that keeps coming back to me even years later is the absolute normalcy of its posture. It wasn't hiding. It wasn't trying to avoid being seen. It stood directly in the center of that road as if it had every right to be there, as if we were the intruders, not it. There was a confidence in its stillness that suggested this was its territory, and it was merely acknowledging our passing through. The terror I felt wasn't from any aggressive action. It was from the fundamental wrongness of the situation, of seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that defied categorization, something that stood on that border between known and unknown. And perhaps most disturbing, something that seemed to be observing us with calm intelligence. In the years since, we've returned to the general Iron Creek area a few times. My wife enjoys the camping there, and I didn't want this experience to rob us of places we love. But I've never tried to find that specific service road again. I don't look down side roads when we're driving through forests anymore. I keep my eyes on the main path ahead, deliberately not seeking out the spaces between trees. Sometimes when we're hiking, I'll get a sudden chill, a feeling of being watched from the dense forest alongside the trail. My wife has noticed I no longer walk at the back of the group when we're with friends. I always position myself in the middle now, never the last one in line. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't have a name for it that doesn't sound ridiculous when said out loud. I know what the legends say about the Pacific Northwest woods, about the creatures that might inhabit the vast stretches of wilderness. Before that afternoon, those were just stories to me. Now I'm not so sure. What I am certain of is this. There was something standing on that service road that day. Something large, dark, and still. Something that was aware of us before we were aware of it. Something that chose to let us pass without incident. And something that I sometimes still see in my dreams. A dark silhouette against a dirt road, watching, listening, waiting. The forest feels different to me now. When I look into the dense trees alongside hiking trails or roads, I no longer see empty spaces. I see places where something could be standing, just a few yards in, perfectly still, watching us pass by. Something that belongs there more than we do. Something that might step out onto the path if it decided to. I've told this story to very few people. Most react with skepticism or nervous laughter. Some suggest I saw a transient, maybe someone living off the grid. Others propose more exotic wildlife explanations. But no one who wasn't there can understand the visceral certainty I felt. This wasn't human, it wasn't a known animal, and it wasn't a trick of light or imagination. I don't expect anyone reading this to believe me either. That's not why I'm sharing it. I'm sharing it because keeping it inside for all these years has been its own kind of burden. And because maybe, just maybe, someone else has seen the same thing. A tall, dark figure, standing perfectly still on a forest road, watching with patient intelligence as humans pass through its domain. If you're ever driving those back roads near Iron Creek and you come to a fork where a smaller road branches off, pay attention. Look carefully at what might be standing there, just at the edge of your perception, and maybe don't stop to investigate. Some things in this world prefer to observe from a distance, and maybe it's better for everyone if that distance is maintained. One last thing. When we got home from that trip, I researched the history of the Iron Creek area. The forests there are old, much older than the roads cutting through them. Native peoples have stories about those woods, about entities that dwell there, watching from the shadows. They have a word for them that translates roughly to the quiet ones who stand between trees. I didn't know that before my encounter. I wish I had. I might have been more careful about where we chose to drive that day. I still have a Mazda, but it's an SUV now. Higher clearance, four-wheel drive. Not that I'm planning to go off-road if I ever see that figure again, but the option to do so helps me sleep better at night. Story 5. What we saw in Gifford Pinchot. I've been going to the Gifford Pinchot National Forest for over 20 years. It's been my favorite fishing spot since my son was just a little guy. We know those service roads like the back of our hands. Every pothole, every turn, every spot where the creek runs close enough to cast a line. I'm not someone who scares easily in the woods. I've encountered bears, cougars, and all kinds of wildlife over the years. But what happened last summer was different. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was mid-July, around 4 in the afternoon. My son and I had spent the morning fishing at our usual spot. We'd had decent luck. Caught a few rainbow trout, nothing spectacular, but enough to make the trip worthwhile. We were heading back down one of those narrow service roads in my truck. It's an older model with a Cummins diesel engine that makes a pretty distinctive rumble, especially when you're crawling along at 15 miles per hour on a rough dirt road. The weather was perfect that day. Clear blue sky, sun shining bright, temperature in the low 70s. No fog, no rain, no weird light conditions that might play tricks on your eyes. Just a perfect, clear summer day in the Washington wilderness. We were moving slowly because the road was pretty rough in spots, with these big water-cut ruts that would bottom out my truck if I went too fast. The forest was thick on both sides, tall Douglas firs and western hemlocks, creating walls of green. There were occasional breaks where you could see through to little meadows or clearings from old logging operations. We came around a bend in the road, and that's when we saw it. Less than 100 yards ahead of us, standing partially in the road, was this figure. At first glance, my brain tried to categorize it as a person, maybe a hiker in dark clothing. But within a split second, I knew that wasn't right. This thing was big, really big, and completely black from head to toe. My son saw it at the same moment I did. I remember hearing him inhale sharply beside me. The diesel engine was pretty loud, but somehow we managed to surprise this thing. It turned toward us with this fluid motion that immediately struck me as not human. The movement was too smooth, too quick for something that size. As soon as it turned and registered our presence, it immediately crossed the road in 3 or 4 long strides. Not running exactly, more like purposeful walking, but covering ground faster than a person could. It headed up the embankment on the opposite side of the road. That's what really got me. The embankment was steep, maybe a 30-degree slope covered in loose dirt and small rocks. The kind of terrain where you'd have to carefully pick your way up, using your hands in places to steady yourself. But this thing went up it like it was walking on flat ground. No hesitation, no slipping, no struggling, just smooth, efficient movement. I stopped the truck without even thinking about it. We were both frozen, watching this thing ascend the slope. The sunlight was hitting it directly, and I could see the hair or fur covering its body had this slight sheen to it. Not shiny exactly, but definitely catching the light in a way that made it clear this wasn't clothing. This was something with a pelt. I'm trying to accurately describe the proportions because this is what convinced me I wasn't looking at a bear or any other animal I'm familiar with. It was tall, if I had to guess, somewhere between 8 and 8.5 feet. But it wasn't bulky, like you'd expect something that tall to be. It had a leanness to it, especially in the limbs. The arms were long, swinging in this pendulum-like motion as it moved. The legs took these economical, measured strides that somehow covered a lot of ground without seeming hurried. And it was bipedal, completely upright the entire time, not hunched over like a bear would be when standing on its hind legs, not shuffling or awkward, just upright and competent in its movements, like this was its natural way of getting around. The head sat directly on the shoulders with minimal neck, giving it this distinctive silhouette against the tree line. I never saw its face. It never turned back to look at us after that initial moment when it registered our presence. Just crossed the road and went up that slope like it had somewhere to be. Within maybe 15 seconds, it had reached the tree line at the top of the embankment and disappeared into the forest. No crashing sounds, no branches breaking. It just vanished into the trees as silently as it had appeared. My son and I sat there in complete silence for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. The truck was still running, the diesel engine idling roughly. Finally, he turned to me with this expression I'll never forget. A mix of shock, confusion, and this fundamental kind of fear that comes from seeing something your brain can't properly categorize. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice higher than normal. All I could do was nod. There was no question about what we'd seen. It wasn't a glimpse or a shadow or something in the corner of our eyes. This was a full, clear sighting in broad daylight at a relatively close distance. After the initial shock wore off, curiosity took over. I put the truck in park, turned off the engine, and told my son we should check out the slope where it had gone up. He was reluctant at first, but I assured him the thing was long gone. We approached the spot cautiously. The road was packed dirt with some gravelly sections, but the embankment was this fine, silty soil, the kind that holds impressions well. And sure enough, there they were, footprints. But not like any footprints I'd ever seen. They were huge, a good 13 inches long at least. They had this clear outline in the soft soil, with what appeared to be 5 toes at the front. The impression was deep, especially at the heel, indicating whatever made them was heavy. What struck me most about the prints was how clear the stride pattern was. You could see exactly how it had moved up that slope. Direct, purposeful steps spaced about 4 to 5 feet apart. No signs of slipping or struggling on the incline, just these methodical, powerful impressions going straight up. We didn't have anything with us to measure them properly or make a cast, but I took out my fishing license to place next to one for scale and snapped a few pictures with my cell phone. The reception out there is non-existent, so I couldn't send them to anyone right then. Standing there, looking at those footprints going up the slope, I felt this weird mix of emotions. There was fear, definitely, but also this sense of, I don't know how to describe it exactly, like I was looking at evidence of something that wasn't supposed to exist, but undeniably did. Something that had been there in these woods all along, maybe watching us on our fishing trips without us ever knowing. My son was visibly uncomfortable. He kept looking up at the tree line where the thing had disappeared, clearly worried it might return. I was too, if I'm being honest. We didn't linger long at the site. As we drove away, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. We went through all the possibilities, bear, moose, elk, but none of them fit. The upright posture, the proportions, the smooth movement, the footprints. Nothing in my experience of wildlife matched up. I've been a hunter and fisherman my whole life. I know what bears look like, even black bears that sometimes walk on their hind legs for short distances. This wasn't that. Bears have this distinctive shoulder hump and move with a rolling gait when they're upright. This thing moved like bipedal walking was its natural state. It wasn't a person in a suit either. The fluid motion, the effortless way it scaled that slope, the size of it. No human could mimic that, especially not in the middle of nowhere with no audience to perform for. We made it back to our cabin about an hour later. The whole drive, I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to find some explanation that made sense. But there wasn't one, at least not one that fit within my understanding of what exists in those woods. The next day, we went back. I know that sounds crazy, but I had to see those footprints again in the clear light of morning. I had to confirm that what we'd seen was real. We brought a small container of plaster of Paris that we'd picked up from the hardware store in the nearest town. When we arrived at the spot, the prints were still there, though slightly degraded from overnight dew. We mixed the plaster and poured it into one of the clearest footprints. While we waited for it to set, we examined the path the creature had taken more carefully. In daylight, you could see where small saplings and undergrowth had been pushed aside as it entered the forest at the top of the embankment. Not broken or damaged, just bent and moved, like whatever this was, had been careful not to leave an obvious trail. Deliberate almost. The plaster cast came out decent. Not perfect, but good enough to clearly show the shape and size of the foot. It's sitting on my desk as I write this, a tangible reminder that I didn't imagine or exaggerate what we saw. Since that day, I've done a lot of research. I've read accounts from other people who've had similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. I've looked at other footprint casts and reports of sightings. Many of them describe the same thing we saw: a tall, dark figure, moving with surprising grace and agility through terrain that would challenge a human. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories. They seem like campfire tales or hoaxes perpetuated by people seeking attention. But now I don't know what to think. All I know is what my son and I saw that day was real. It was solid. It moved with purpose and intelligence. And it was definitely not something that's supposed to exist according to science. The most unsettling part wasn't the size or even the strangeness of the creature. It was the complete lack of hesitation or surprise in its behavior. It noticed us, made an immediate decision to leave the area, and did so with a confidence that suggested it knew exactly what we were and wanted no interaction. There was an intelligence there that I felt but can't properly explain. We still go fishing in Gifford Pinchot. I'm not going to let one strange encounter ruin decades of tradition. But we're more alert now. We pay attention to sounds in the forest in a way we didn't before. We notice broken branches and unusual tracks. And sometimes, when the forest goes quiet for no apparent reason, I get this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like we're being watched from just beyond the tree line. I don't know what it was we saw crossing that service road last summer. I don't have a name for it that doesn't sound ridiculous when said out loud. But I know what I saw. I know what my son saw. And I have a plaster cast of a 13-inch footprint that doesn't match any known animal to prove it. Sometimes at night, I still see it in my mind. That fluid motion as it crossed the road, the effortless way it scaled that slope, the absolute certainty of its movements. And I wonder how many times it or others like it have been within yards of me in those woods, watching, waiting, choosing to remain unseen until that one time when our paths happened to cross. The forest feels different to me now, deeper somehow, more mysterious, and much, much older than I ever realized before. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just sharing what happened because keeping it to myself hasn't made it any easier to understand. All I know is that on a clear summer day in Gifford Pinchot National Forest, my son and I saw something impossible cross a service road right in front of us. Something that moved like it belonged there much more than we ever will. Story 6. Number sign What We Heard in the Cascades. I've been hunting the western slopes of the Cascade Mountains since I was a kid. My grandfather taught my father taught me, and I've taught my son. We know these woods, the smell of them, the sounds, the way the light filters through the trees at different times of day. When you've spent as much time in the wilderness as I have, you develop a sense for when something isn't right. Animals speak a language of behavior, and after 30+ years of hunting, I can read it pretty well. What happened in November of 1997 still bothers me. I've tried to explain it away, tried to file it under weird but natural phenomena, but I can't. My son and I don't talk about it much, but I know it affected him too. He doesn't hunt alone anymore. Neither do I. It was the second weekend of the season, and we'd set up on a ridge overlooking a valley. Perfect spot. We could see a good portion of the terrain below while staying hidden in a small cluster of trees. The weather was crisp but not uncomfortable, around 40 degrees with patches of early morning fog burning off in the valleys. The kind of still, clear day when you can hear a twig snap from 300 yards away. We'd been in position since before dawn, maybe 5:30 in the morning. By 10 o'clock, we'd seen a few does, but no bucks worth taking. My son had brought his. 300 Winchester Magnum, a serious rifle with serious stopping power. Overkill for deer, but he'd saved up for it himself and was proud of it. I had my usual. 30-06, nothing fancy but reliable. The spot we'd chosen was about halfway up a ridge that overlooked a kind of natural funnel, a place where the terrain guided animals along predictable paths. Below us was a steep slope covered in ferns and smaller trees, then a small meadow, and beyond that denser forest. From our vantage point, we could see any movement in that meadow or on the slopes on either side. Around 11:30, I was starting to think about suggesting we move to a different location when I heard something strange. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but there wasn't any. The day was dead calm. The sound was coming from the slope below us, from the direction of the denser woods beyond the meadow. It's hard to describe what I heard. The closest thing I can compare it to is the murmur of conversation, like when you can hear people talking in another room but can't make out the words. Two distinct voices, I guess you'd call them. Low, rumbling, almost beneath the threshold of hearing, but definitely there. Like two men having a conversation far away, but the cadence was wrong. Too rhythmic, almost like they were taking turns, one voice and then the other. I nudged my son and put my finger to my lips, then pointed toward the sound. He nodded, he heard it too. We both went completely still, barely breathing. The voices continued for maybe 30 seconds, getting slightly louder, which meant whatever was making them was moving uphill, coming in our direction. Then they stopped abruptly, and that silence was somehow worse than the sounds had been. I was just about to whisper to my son when I felt it, a vibration in the ground beneath me, not like an earthquake, but like something heavy walking. Two distinct impacts, a pause, then two more. The rhythm was unmistakable. Boom, boom, pause, boom, boom. Regular, deliberate, like footsteps, but heavier than any human could make. These footsteps were coming up the slope toward us, following roughly the same direction the voices had been, but faster now, with purpose. Whatever it was covering ground quickly. I shifted my position slightly to get a better view down the slope, and my son raised his rifle, looking through the scope to try to spot whatever was approaching. The footsteps continued, boom, boom, pause, boom, boom, getting louder, the vibrations more distinct with each impact. And then, just for a split second, I saw it. At the edge of my field of vision, maybe 70 yards away, a dark figure crossed between two trees. Just a glimpse, a black shape moving with surprising speed considering its size. It was upright, that much I could tell, and big, not just tall, but solid. I couldn't make out features, just an impression of mass and movement. My son must have seen it through his scope because I heard his breath catch. He tracked something with his rifle for a few seconds, then lowered it slowly. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my back despite the cool air. The footsteps had stopped. The forest around us went completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just absolute stillness. It's a silence I've experienced before. Usually when there's a predator in the area. All the smaller creatures go quiet, trying not to attract attention. But this silence felt deeper, more absolute, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We sat there completely motionless for what must have been 15 minutes, but felt like hours. My muscles were cramping from the strain of staying so still, but something primal in me knew that movement would be a mistake. Finally, far off to our left, I heard a single branch snap, then nothing. We waited another half hour before we dared to move or speak. By then, normal forest sounds had gradually returned, a chickadee calling, the rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. The sense of immediate danger had passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Let's pack up," I said quietly. "I think we're done for today." My son didn't argue. We gathered our gear and headed back toward our camp, taking a route that gave the area where we'd seen the figure a wide berth. Neither of us wanted to cross its path. Back at camp, as we made coffee on the small stove, we finally talked about what had happened. We tried to rationalize it, to fit it into our understanding of the world. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. Maybe the voices were just some kind of strange echo or animal sound we weren't familiar with. But we both knew bears don't walk rhythmically on two legs for extended periods. They don't make sounds that mimic human conversation, and they don't move with the fluid, purposeful gait that we'd glimpsed between those trees. "What do you think it was?" my son finally asked, his eyes serious in a way I hadn't seen before. I took a long sip of coffee before answering. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I've been hunting these woods for most of my life, and I've never heard anything like that before. What bothered me most wasn't the glimpse of the figure. It was too brief to really register details. It was the footsteps, the deliberate rhythmic nature of them. 2 steps, pause, 2 steps. The pattern of it, like whatever it was walking with intention, with a method. There was intelligence in that rhythm, a purposefulness that animals don't typically display. And there was the fact that it had been coming directly toward our position. Not wandering randomly, not moving along a game trail, but heading straight for the ridge where we were sitting. Almost like it knew we were there, like it was checking us out. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside our tent had me alert, listening for that distinctive pattern of footsteps. I kept my rifle closer than usual, though some part of me doubted it would make much difference if whatever we'd encountered decided to approach our camp. We left the next morning, cutting our trip short by 2 days. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both wanted to be away from that place. Something about the experience had fundamentally unsettled us, shaken our confidence in our understanding of these woods that we thought we knew so well. In the years since, I've done a lot of research. I've read accounts from other hunters and hikers who've had similar experiences in the Cascades, stories about strange sounds in the forest, about glimpses of large, dark figures moving with surprising agility through difficult terrain, about footsteps that don't match any known animal. I've also learned that the indigenous peoples of this region have traditions about beings that dwell in the deep forests, beings that are neither human nor animal, that can speak to each other in ways that sometimes sound almost like human voices, beings that are territorial and observant, that watch humans from a distance, but prefer not to be seen. I still hunt, and so does my son, but we don't go back to that particular ridge, and we never hunt alone anymore. There's safety in numbers, yes, but it's more than that. It's the need for someone else to witness, to confirm, to share the burden if we ever hear those footsteps again. The most unsettling part of the whole experience wasn't fear of attack. Whatever was there could have easily reached us if it wanted to. No, what chilled me to the core was the sense that we had been evaluated, considered, that something had heard or smelled us from a distance, deliberately approached to get a closer look, and then made a decision to withdraw. There was judgment in those footsteps, intelligence, purpose, and that's far more disturbing to me than any ordinary predator could ever be. Sometimes, when I'm in the woods now, I'll stop and just listen, not for deer or elk, but for that distinctive rhythm. Boom, boom, pause, boom, boom. For those low, rumbling voices that weren't quite voices. I haven't heard them again, and part of me hopes I never do. But another part, the part that's been drawn to these forests my whole life, wonders what's out there in the deep valleys between the peaks, wonders what walks those slopes when no humans are around to see, wonders what was behind that brief, dark shape I glimpsed between the trees on a clear November day in 1997. The rational part of my mind says there must be an explanation. Some animal I'm not familiar with, some acoustic phenomenon that created those voice-like sounds, some trick of light and shadow that made a bear or elk look like something else entirely. But then I remember the way the ground vibrated beneath me with each heavy step. I remember the perfect rhythm of those footsteps coming up the slope, I remember the abrupt silence that fell when whatever it was stopped moving, like the forest was acknowledging something ancient and powerful in its midst. And I know with a certainty that defies rational explanation that what we encountered that day wasn't something science has catalogued and explained. It was something older, something that belongs to these mountains in a way we never will. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. I probably wouldn't if someone else told it to me. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt in the ground beneath me. And I know what my son and I glimpsed, however briefly, moving between those trees. Whatever it was, it's still out there, walking those same slopes with that same deliberate rhythm, watching, listening, waiting for unwary humans to venture too deep into valleys where they don't belong. When I'm in the woods now, I listen differently. I pay attention to silence as much as sound. And when the birds suddenly go quiet and the hairs on my neck stand up, I don't linger. Because now I know, in those ancient forests at the feet of the Cascades, we are never truly alone. And not everything that watches us from the shadows is something we have names for. Story 7. The thing that watched me on State Route 503. I've been driving State Route 503 toward Cougar for years. It's a beautiful stretch of road, especially in the summer when the forests are lush and green. But after what happened last month, I don't think I'll ever see it the same way again. I've gone back and forth about sharing this, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. It was a Tuesday morning, around 3 a.m. I know that sounds like a weird time to be driving, but I work night shifts at a manufacturing plant in Vancouver, and I was heading to my cabin for a couple days off. I usually enjoy these early morning drives. Hardly any traffic, just me and the road and the stars overhead. Something peaceful about having the world to yourself for a little while. The forecast had called for mild temperatures, mid-50s, but as I got further away from town and deeper into the forest, I noticed the temperature gauge on my dashboard dropping fast. By the time I was about 20 miles from Cougar, it was showing 38 degrees, unusually cold for that time of year. The road gets pretty winding as you head toward Cougar, with steep drop-offs on one side and dense forest on the other. My headlights would catch the reflective eyes of deer or raccoons occasionally, nothing unusual for that area. I had the radio off, just the sound of my tires on the pavement and the heater blowing. As I rounded a bend, I noticed patches of fog starting to form in low-lying areas. Nothing thick yet, just wisps of white hovering above the ground in spots. The moon was nearly full that night, so there was decent visibility even where my headlights didn't reach. The trees cast these long shadows across the road that seemed to shift and move as I drove past. I was about 5 miles from Cougar when the temperature suddenly dropped even further. I watched the gauge fall from 38 to 32 degrees in the span of maybe half a mile. At the same time, the fog started getting thicker, collecting in the dips and curves of the road ahead. That's when I decided to turn around. I'm not usually one to change plans over a little cold weather, but something felt off. The sudden temperature drop, the rapidly thickening fog, it just gave me a bad feeling. My cabin would still be there tomorrow when the weather cleared. I slowed down, looking for a safe place to turn around on the narrow highway. There was a small pull-off coming up on the right, just wide enough for a car to make a 3-point turn. As I approached it and started to brake, something happened that I still can't explain. My car just died, completely shut off without warning. 1 second I'm driving, the next there's total silence. The engine stopped, the headlights went out, even the dashboard lights. Just darkness and silence except for the soft click of my emergency flashes automatically activating and the sound of wind moving through the trees. My first thought was electrical failure, maybe a fuse or the alternator. I wasn't particularly worried yet, just annoyed at the inconvenience. I tried turning the key again, but nothing happened. Not even a click or a grinding sound. Complete non-response. like the battery was disconnected. I reached for my phone to use as a flashlight, and that's when I looked up through the windshield. About 30 yards ahead, just at the edge of where my emergency flasher's light reached, something was standing on the shoulder of the road. At first glance, I thought it might be a deer frozen in place. But no, this was standing fully upright, tall, much taller than a person. The proportions were all wrong. I couldn't make out details in the darkness, just a silhouette. But what I could see was broad shoulders, maybe 3 feet across, and a head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders with no visible neck. It was completely motionless, facing in my direction. My skin immediately broke out in goosebumps, and my mouth went dry. Whatever this was, it wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. Bears have a distinctive hunched posture when upright. This thing was standing straight, its posture almost military in its rigidity. For what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, neither of us moved. My emergency lights blinked rhythmically, casting alternating red light and shadow across the road, but never quite reaching where this figure stood. I had the overwhelming sensation that it was looking directly at me, studying me, even though I couldn't see its face. In a moment of panic, I tried the ignition again, turning the key with much more force than necessary. To my surprise, the engine caught immediately. The headlights blazed back to life, the dashboard lit up, and the sudden brightness after the darkness was almost blinding. In that instant of illumination, I got a clearer look at the figure. My headlights hit it directly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, not clothing. This wasn't a person. The proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad, arms hanging too low. The moment my engine roared to life, the figure reacted. It turned away from me with a smoothness that seemed impossible for something that size. There was no awkward shifting of weight, no human-like pivot. It was like watching something rotate on a mechanical axis, one fluid motion that took it from facing me to facing the forest. Then it moved toward the tree line. Its gait was unlike anything I've seen before. Long, deliberate strides that covered ground with terrifying efficiency. Its arms swung loosely at its sides, too long, the hands hanging lower than a person's would. 3 or 4 steps, and it disappeared into the darkness between the trees. I sat there, engine running, completely frozen. My brain couldn't process what I'd just seen. It didn't move like a person in a costume. It didn't move like any animal I've ever encountered. The mechanical precision of its movements, the unnatural smoothness. It was deeply, fundamentally wrong in a way that's hard to articulate. That's when the delayed wave of terror hit me. I suddenly realized that this thing had been standing there before my car died. It had been watching me approach, standing motionless on the shoulder of the road. How long had it been there? Had it been following me, waiting for me? I fumbled with the gear shift, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the car into reverse. I backed up, made a frantic 3-point turn, and headed back the way I'd come, driving faster than was safe on that winding road. As I drove, a new fear gripped me. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, convinced I would see that figure again. Maybe standing in the middle of the road behind me, or worse, running after my car with those long, efficient strides. The road was empty in my mirrors, but that didn't ease my panic. I felt a distinct sensation of being watched the entire drive back. It was like a physical pressure on the back of my neck, a certainty that eyes were following my progress from just beyond the reach of my taillights. I kept expecting to hear footsteps on the gravel alongside the road, keeping pace with my car. I cranked the heat up but couldn't stop shivering. What terrifies me most, looking back, isn't just what I saw. It's the implications of what happened. My car died at exactly the moment I was closest to that thing. No warning signs, no sputtering engine, no electrical flickering, just sudden, complete shutdown. And then it started again perfectly, no issues, the moment I needed to escape. Was that a coincidence? I don't think so. Somehow, I believe that thing affected my car. Maybe it's some kind of electromagnetic field they generate. Maybe it's something science can't explain yet. But the timing was too perfect to be random chance. And then there's the way it moved when it left. That pivot, like a soldier doing an about face, but impossibly smooth. The way it walked into the forest, not crashing through underbrush like you'd expect from something that size, but moving with precision, with purpose, with intelligence. I made it back to Vancouver around 5 in the morning. I didn't stop once on the drive back, didn't even slow down unless I absolutely had to. My hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. My back was soaked with sweat despite the cold. I called in sick to work the next day. Couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what I'd seen, who would believe me. I kept trying to rationalize it, to find some explanation that made sense. Maybe it was a person playing a prank. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by fog and moonlight and my own tired mind. But I know what I saw. And in the weeks since, I've been researching similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. There are more than you might think. People describing tall, upright figures with impossible movements, cars and electronic equipment failing when these things are nearby. The feeling of being watched, measured, evaluated. The locals around Cougar don't like to talk about it much, but if you get them comfortable enough, if they think you won't laugh or dismiss them, the stories come out. Hunters who've found strange footprints too large to be human. Hikers who've heard vocalizations in the forest that sound almost like speech, but not quite. Rangers who won't go to certain areas alone, especially at night. I've driven SR 503 since then, but only in daylight, only with other people in the car. I don't take that road alone anymore, and I certainly don't drive it at 3 in the morning. I find myself constantly checking the tree line, searching for a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette, watching from just beyond the edge of visibility. The rational part of my brain says there must be a logical explanation for what I saw. The primitive part, the part connected to instincts that kept our ancestors alive, knows better. Something was on that road with me that night. Something intelligent enough to observe, to strategize, to wait for the perfect moment. Something that didn't want to be seen, but allowed itself to be glimpsed, perhaps as a warning. I don't know what to call what I saw. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, forest giant. The name doesn't really matter. What matters is that it's out there, in the forests around Cougar, watching from the darkness as we pass through its territory, usually unaware of its presence. Sometimes I dream about that moment when our headlights hit it directly, and it turned with that fluid, inhuman motion. In my dreams, though, it doesn't walk away into the forest. In my dreams, it turns and walks toward my car instead, its face still shrouded in shadow, its long arms reaching for my door handle. I always wake up before I see its face, my heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night on SR 503. I don't know if I want to. Some mysteries might be better left unsolved. All I know is that the forests of Washington hold secrets that most of us never glimpse. We drive through, hike through, camp within them, thinking we're alone or that we understand the wildlife around us. But sometimes, when the conditions are just right, when you're alone on a cold, foggy night and your car suddenly dies miles from anywhere, you might get a glimpse of something watching from the darkness, something that's been there all along, observing silently as we pass through its domain, usually choosing to remain hidden, but occasionally allowing itself to be seen. And if that happens to you, if your car mysteriously dies on SR 503 in the early morning hours, and you see a tall figure watching you from the roadside, my advice is simple. Get your car started again as quickly as you can, turn around, and drive away. Don't look back. Don't slow down. And whatever you do, don't stop again until you're back in populated areas, because I can't shake the feeling that I was lucky that night. That whatever I encountered chose to walk away rather than approach. That next time, if there is a next time, things might end differently. The forests around Cougar feel different to me now. Older, wilder, less known. I used to find comfort in the wilderness, in the solitude. Now I understand that we're never truly alone out there, and some things that watch us from the shadows are better left undisturbed. Story 8. Two figures in the clearing. I've owned my hunting property outside of Cougar, Washington for almost 15 years. It's not huge, about 40 acres, but it backs up against national forest land, which makes it feel much larger. I've always felt comfortable there, spending countless weekends maintaining trails, setting up blinds, and tracking the deer that move through the area. Until last October, I'd never felt unwelcome or unsafe on my own land. That day started like any other fall weekend. I drove up early Saturday morning in my pickup, planning to drop salt blocks at my usual hunting spots before the season opened. It was routine maintenance, something I'd done dozens of times before. The weather was perfect, mid-50s with patchy clouds, not too cold yet, but you could feel that crisp autumn air. I parked at the end of my access road around 9 in the morning. The first 2 salt blocks were easy, just a short walk to established spots near the north edge of my property. I saved the farthest location for last. This spot was about a mile from where I parked, across a small creek and up a gentle slope that opened into a natural meadow of tall grass. The deer love that area. It's a perfect feeding ground with good visibility for them, bordered by thick forest on 3 sides. The hike in was uneventful. I had my backpack with tools, water, and the last 50-pound salt block. It's awkward to carry, but I'm used to it. As I approached the meadow, I remember noticing how quiet it was. Normally there are birds, squirrels, the usual forest sounds, but that morning there was just the sound of my boots on the trail and the occasional breeze through the trees. I reached the edge of the meadow around 10:30. It's not massive, maybe 75 yards across at its widest, but it's a beautiful spot. The grass was tall that day, almost waist-high in places, still green but starting to turn that golden fall color. I could see my usual salt lick location on the far side, marked by a lone Douglas fir that stands slightly apart from the main tree line. I started across the meadow, following the faint trail I'd worn over years of visits. The grass brushed against my legs as I walked. The sun had broken through the clouds, warming my face. It was so peaceful that I wasn't really paying attention to my surroundings, just enjoying the morning and thinking about the upcoming hunting season. I was about halfway across when I saw it. From the right side of the meadow, where the forest was densest, a figure emerged into the open. At first, my brain tried to process it as a person, maybe another hunter trespassing. But within seconds, I realized this was not human, not even close. It was tall, 8 feet at least. Its body was covered in what looked like short black hair or fur, uniformly dark except for the exposed skin on its face and hands. The body was powerfully built, broad shoulders, thick chest, long arms that hung down, with the hands almost reaching mid-thigh. But it was the proportions that were so wrong, too tall, too broad, limbs too long to be human. The face is what immediately told me this wasn't a person in a suit or some kind of prank. The forehead sloped back dramatically, giving the skull this distinctive profile that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't make out detailed facial features from that distance. It was about 25 yards away, but I could see enough to know this was something other. It walked with purpose, not hurried, not cautious, just deliberate. Each step it took caused the dry grass to crack audibly under its weight. That sound, crack, 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 is permanently etched in my memory. It was heading directly across my path, moving from one side of the meadow toward the forest on the opposite side. I froze completely. The salt block felt impossibly heavy in my arms. I couldn't move, couldn't call out, couldn't do anything but stand there and watch this impossible thing cross in front of me. The creature never looked in my direction, never acknowledged me in any way. It just continued its purposeful walk across the meadow as if I didn't exist. and somehow that was more terrifying than if it had charged at me or shown aggression. There was something deeply unsettling about being so completely dismissed, like I was so insignificant it didn't even warrant a glance. As it moved, I could see its hands swinging slightly, the knuckles faced forward, unlike a human's natural hand position. The fingers looked longer than they should be, but proportional to its size. I remember thinking how natural its movement looked, not awkward or lumbering, like you might expect from something so large. It moved with an efficiency and grace that seemed impossible for its size. Just as it was about to reach the tree line on the far side of the meadow, something even more shocking happened. A second figure emerged from the shadows of the forest where the first was heading. At first just a dark shape among the trees, but then it took a step forward, and I could see it was almost identical to the first. Same height, same build, same black coloration. This second one stood partially obscured by the trees, watching as the first one approached. There was something about the way they moved, the way they seemed to acknowledge each other without any visible communication, that suggested intelligence, purpose. These weren't animals acting on instinct. There was intent behind their movements. The first figure reached the edge of the forest and, without hesitation, disappeared into the trees alongside the second one. They blended into the shadows so completely it was like they'd never been there at all. For several seconds after they disappeared, I remained frozen in place. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mouth had gone completely dry. I was afraid to move, afraid that any sound might bring them back, or worse, make them notice me this time. What struck me most in those moments of pure terror wasn't just what I'd seen, but what I hadn't seen or heard. There had been no displays of aggression, no chest pounding, no roaring, none of the behaviors you might expect from large primates. No strong smell that people often report in these encounters. No broken branches or signs of destruction, just two enormous, impossible creatures moving through their environment with complete confidence. The exposed skin I could see on their hands and faces wasn't the pink of human skin or the black of gorilla skin. It was a deep, weathered brown, like old leather that had been exposed to the elements for years. No shine to it, no reflection in the sunlight, just this matte, textured appearance that looked ancient somehow. When I finally regained my ability to move, I didn't think. I just reacted. I dropped the salt block right there in the grass. It tumbled down the slight incline toward the creek. I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to my truck as quickly and quietly as possible. I turned and walked back the way I'd come, forcing myself not to run. Some primal instinct told me that running might trigger a predatory response if they were still watching. So I walked, quickly but steadily, keeping my eyes forward, not daring to look back toward where they'd disappeared. The walk back to my truck was the longest of my life. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide another of those creatures. I kept expecting to hear that distinctive sound of heavy footsteps behind me, but there was nothing. Just the hammering of my own heart and my increasingly ragged breathing. When I finally reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I started the engine and pulled out, driving faster than was safe on that rough access road, needing to put as much distance as possible between myself and what I'd seen. It's been 8 months since that day, and I haven't been back to that part of my property. I've tried to convince myself that there must be some explanation, that maybe it was bears, or my eyes playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. Those weren't bears. Bears don't walk upright with that kind of fluid grace. Bears don't have that distinctive head shape or those proportions. And bears certainly don't move with that kind of deliberate purpose. What stays with me most vividly is the image of those broad backs as they disappeared into the trees. The way the shoulders connected almost directly to the head with barely any visible neck. The slightly longer hair along the upper back. The absolute confidence in their movements. They weren't afraid of me. They weren't even interested in me. They were simply passing through, following some path they'd probably walked countless times before I ever owned that piece of paper saying the land was mine. I've spent hours researching similar encounters since then. I've read about traditional Sasquatch or Bigfoot sightings, trying to make sense of what I saw. Some descriptions match: the height, the dark coloration, the sloped forehead. But most accounts describe single creatures, not pairs moving together with such coordinated purpose. I've told only 2 people about what happened: my brother and my closest friend. Both listened without interrupting, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. I don't blame them. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have thought they were exaggerating or flat out lying. Some things you simply can't believe until you see them with your own eyes. I still own the property, I still pay the taxes on it, but now I only visit the areas closest to the access road. I've abandoned my best hunting spots, including the salt lick by that meadow. Part of me wants to set up trail cameras to try to get evidence of what I saw. But a stronger part wants nothing to do with those creatures ever again. Because the truth is, what I saw that day shattered my understanding of the world in a fundamental way. It wasn't just fear I felt, though there was plenty of that. It was the sudden, jarring realization that something this large, this significant, could exist without our knowledge or acknowledgement. That these creatures could be living in the forests around Cougar, Washington, forests I thought I knew intimately, without leaving enough evidence for science to confirm their existence. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the clear sense that they were comfortable there, that they belonged there in a way that I, for all my years of ownership and familiarity with the land, never would. They moved through that meadow like they'd been crossing it for generations before I was born, and would continue to do so long after I'm gone. Sometimes at night, I still hear that sound in my dreams. Crack, crack, crack. The dry grass breaking under heavy, deliberate footsteps. I see those broad, sloping shoulders disappearing into the tree line. And I wake up with the absolute certainty that they're still out there, moving through the forests of Washington with the same quiet purpose, occasionally glimpsed but never truly seen, a living secret walking just beyond the edge of our understanding. I don't know what they are. I don't know if they're some undiscovered species, some evolutionary branch we've never documented. All I know is what I saw that October morning in a meadow I thought was mine, and the silent message their presence seemed to convey: this isn't your land. It never was. Story 9. 3 seconds on Interstate 80. I've been debating whether to share this for months. It's not that I'm worried about ridicule. I've reached an age where I don't much care what others think, but because I still struggle to make sense of what I saw. Some experiences defy easy explanation, and what happened to me on Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania last summer falls squarely in that category. My wife and I were driving back from visiting our daughter in Ohio. We'd made this trip dozens of times over the years, so I knew the route well. Every rest stop, every notable landmark, every stretch where state troopers like to hide. It was a clear day in late June, around 2 in the afternoon. Perfect driving conditions, sunny, minimal traffic, good visibility. We were somewhere in western Pennsylvania, where I-80 cuts through miles of dense forest. If you've driven this stretch, you know what I mean. Endless green on both sides, the highway carving a path through wilderness that stretches for miles in every direction. I had the cruise control set at 65, my usual highway speed. Nothing remarkable about the drive. My wife had dozed off about 20 minutes earlier, her head resting against the passenger window. I remember I was thinking about some home repairs I needed to tackle when we got back. The kind of mundane thoughts that occupy your mind during a long drive. The radio was playing softly, tuned to a classic rock station that was starting to break up as we moved out of range. That's when I saw it. Something to my right, about 30 degrees from my direct line of sight, caught my attention. It wasn't movement that drew my eye. It was the opposite. a stillness that seemed out of place in the sea of gently swaying trees and underbrush. For 3 seconds, and I'm specific about this because I've replayed this moment countless times in my mind, I had a clear view of the upper half of a figure standing motionless about 30 yards from the highway shoulder. The lower portion was obscured by underbrush and a slight rise in the terrain, but the torso, shoulders and head were visible above the vegetation. In those 3 seconds, my brain tried desperately to categorize what I was seeing. A hunter in a ghillie suit? No, hunting season was months away. A park ranger? This wasn't parkland. And there were no trails or access roads visible. A stranded motorist who'd wandered into the woods. The posture was too still, too deliberate. What I saw was a figure with unusually broad shoulders, covered in what appeared to be a coat of short reddish-brown fur or hair, or the color reminded me exactly of a brown paper grocery bag that's been sitting in the sun. That matte, warm, brownish tone. Not black, not chocolate brown, but that distinctive reddish brown that almost glows when sunlight hits it directly. I couldn't see its face clearly. The hair seemed to fall forward, obscuring its features. But the body itself looked solid and muscular, definitely not a mannequin or decoy. There was mass to it, substance, a physical presence that registered as a living being. What struck me most, what sent that cold shiver up my spine, wasn't anything the figure did. It was what it didn't do. It didn't move. It didn't react to our passing car. It just stood there, partially concealed by foliage, watching the highway with what felt like deliberate intent. Like it was observing, studying, taking note of the vehicles passing by. I'm a retired commercial pilot. For decades, my job required me to make split-second assessments based on visual information, judging distances, analyzing what I was seeing, determining what was real and what might be an optical illusion. Those skills become second nature after 30 years in the cockpit. So in those 3 seconds, I was automatically processing what I was seeing: color, volume, parallax shift as we moved past, texture and substance. Everything about my visual assessment told me this was a solid 3-dimensional figure standing in those woods, not a trick of light and shadow, not a misidentified tree stump or bush. This was something large, bipedal and alive, standing perfectly still as we drove past at 65 miles per hour. And then it was gone. A small rise in the terrain blocked my view, and when the landscape leveled out again, there was nothing to see but trees and underbrush. No figure, no movement. Just the Pennsylvania forest rolling by outside my window. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling a distinct chill on the back of my neck. That primitive warning system that tells you something isn't right. My first instinct was to brake, to pull over, to go back and confirm what I'd seen. But this was Interstate 80. Stopping on the shoulder would be dangerous, and there was no exit nearby. Besides, what would I do? Hike into the woods looking for something that could easily disappear into the wilderness long before I reached the spot. So I kept driving, glancing repeatedly in my rearview mirror, as if I might catch another glimpse somehow. My wife stirred slightly but didn't wake up. I was almost glad she hadn't seen it. Trying to explain what I'd just witnessed, even to someone who trusts me implicitly, felt impossible in that moment. For the next 50 miles, I drove in a state of hyper-awareness, scanning the tree line on both sides of the highway, half expecting to see that figure again. My mind raced through possible explanations, each less convincing than the last. A bear standing on its hind legs. No, the proportions were wrong, and bears don't stand motionless like that for extended periods. A person in some kind of costume? Out there, miles from any access road or trail, with no apparent purpose. It made no sense. When my wife finally woke up about an hour later, I debated whether to tell her. I finally did, trying to sound casual, describing it as something weird I'd seen in the woods. But even as I spoke, I was downplaying what I'd seen, making it sound less significant than it felt. I think part of me was already trying to rationalize the experience, to file it away as something explainable. But I couldn't shake it. That night at our hotel, I found myself searching online for reports of similar sightings along I-80 in Pennsylvania. I was surprised to find several accounts from drivers describing tall, hair-covered figures spotted from the highway in that same general region. Some were recent, some dated back decades. The descriptions varied in details, but the core elements were consistently similar to what I'd seen. In the months since, I've thought about those 3 seconds almost daily. It might seem strange that such a brief moment could have such a lasting impact. But there was something profound about that glimpse, like accidentally pulling back a curtain and seeing something you weren't meant to see. What keeps haunting me isn't just what I saw, but the implication of it. If what I glimpsed was what many would call a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, and I'm still not comfortable putting that label on it, then it means these creatures exist within sight of one of the busiest interstate highways in America. It means they're watching our cars go by, observing our movements, remaining hidden, except for those rare moments when someone happens to look in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. That thought fundamentally changes how I perceive the wilderness around me. Those dense forests that border our highways and surround our towns. They're not empty. They're not just filled with the deer and birds and other wildlife we acknowledge. There's something else out there too. Something intelligent enough to remain largely undetected despite being in relatively close proximity to human activity. The stillness of that figure is what disturbs me most in retrospect. It wasn't moving through the landscape. It was deliberately positioned to observe the highway. It was watching us. And the only reason I saw it at all was because I happened to glance in that direction during the brief window when it was visible from the road. How many times have I driven past similar figures without noticing them? How many times have you? That's the thought that gives me chills now when I drive through wooded areas. The sense that just beyond the tree line, just out of sight, something might be standing perfectly still, watching our cars pass by. I've always considered myself a rational person. My career as a pilot demanded it. I dealt in measurable facts, in physics and mathematics and verifiable data. But those 3 seconds on Interstate 80 forced me to confront the possibility that there are things in this world that exist outside our comfortable frameworks of understanding. I've gone back and forth about what to do with this experience. Part of me wanted to officially report it to one of those organizations that track such sightings, but another part hesitated. What would be the point? I have no evidence, no photos, nothing but my own testimony about something I glimpsed for 3 seconds while driving at 65 miles per hour. And yet, I know what I saw. The more I've researched, the more I've found similar accounts from credible witnesses, police officers, military personnel, doctors, people with solid reputations, and nothing to gain from sharing their experiences. Many describe the same reddish-brown coloration I saw, the same broad shoulders, the same sense of being observed by something that chose to remain mostly hidden. There's a curious pattern to many of these sightings. They often happen to people who weren't looking for anything unusual, who glimpsed something by chance while going about their ordinary lives. People like me, who had no expectation of seeing anything out of the ordinary on a routine drive they'd made countless times before. I've driven that stretch of I-80 twice since my experience. Both times, I found myself scanning the tree line obsessively, hoping for another glimpse, but also dreading it. I'm not sure I want confirmation of what I saw. There's a certain comfort in uncertainty, in the ability to tell myself that maybe, just maybe, my eyes played tricks on me that day, but deep down I know better. I know what I saw standing in those Pennsylvania woods. I know it was watching the highway with purpose and intelligence. And I know that it's probably still out there, along with others of its kind. observing our human world from the shadows while remaining just beyond the reach of our definitive discovery. Every time I drive through a wooded area now, I can't help but look more carefully at the spaces between the trees. I find myself wondering about the vast stretches of forest that border our roads and towns, and what might be watching us from just beyond the edge of our awareness. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if I'd been able to stop safely, if I'd had a chance to go back and investigate what I'd seen. Would I have found evidence, footprints, broken branches, signs of its presence? Or would I have found nothing, the figure having melted away into the forest without a trace? I'm almost grateful that stopping wasn't an option. There's something unsettling about the thought of entering those woods, of potentially coming face to face with whatever I saw. Not because I fear it would be dangerous, it made no threatening moves, showed no aggression, but because some discoveries fundamentally change your understanding of the world. And once that understanding is changed, there's no going back to the comfortable certainty of what you thought you knew. So I drive on, eyes constantly scanning the tree line now, wondering if I'll ever have another 3-second window into a world that exists alongside ours, but separate from it. A world where creatures we've relegated to myth and legend go about their lives, watching us from just beyond the edge of our perception, present but unseen except in those rare, fleeting moments when the veil between our realities momentarily thins. And if you're driving Interstate 80 through Pennsylvania, or any highway that cuts through miles of dense forest, maybe take your eyes off the road for just a second and glance toward the tree line. You never know what might be standing there, watching you pass by perfectly still and nearly invisible unless you happen to look at exactly the right moment. Story 10. Number sign what was stalking us in Clearfield County. I've been hunting in the Pennsylvania woods since I was 12 years old. My dad taught me everything. How to track, how to move quietly, how to respect the forest and the animals in it. We've spent countless seasons together in those woods, but what happened in Clearfield County 3 years ago changed something fundamental in how I view the wilderness. Some experiences you can't explain away, no matter how hard you try. It was early November, perfect hunting weather, crisp, cold enough that your breath fogged, but not so cold that your fingers went numb on the trigger. We'd driven up before dawn, arriving at our usual spot as the sky was just beginning to lighten. It was a place we'd hunted many times before, a stretch of dense forest that backs up to state game lands. The terrain there is typical Pennsylvania woodland, rolling hills, thick pine stands mixed with oak and maple, lots of natural funnels and ridgelines that channel deer movement. Our plan that day was simple. Dad would set up in a small clearing about halfway up the main ridge, a natural meadow where deer often grazed in the late afternoon. I would continue up and over the ridge to hunt the other side, where there was a series of well-used game trails. We'd hunt separately until dusk, then meet back at the meadow before hiking out together. Everything went according to plan at first. I helped Dad get set up in his spot. He's in his 70s now, still sharp as ever, but slower than he used to be. His position was perfect, a fallen log at the edge of the meadow with good visibility and natural cover. Once he was situated, I continued up the ridge, planning to be in position well before the evening movement started. The hike up was uneventful. It was about a mile from Dad's spot to mine, mostly uphill through increasingly dense pine forest. I remember noticing how quiet it was, that deep forest silence that's not really silence at all, but a subtle symphony of small sounds, wind in the branches, the occasional scurrying of a squirrel, distant bird calls, normal forest sounds that any hunter becomes attuned to. I reached my spot around 3 in the afternoon, a natural bench about 2/3 of the way up the ridge that overlooked several converging game trails. I settled in against the base of a large oak, arranged my gear, and prepared for the wait. I had my Winchester Model 94 lever action, a rifle I'd inherited from my grandfather. Not the most powerful gun in the world, but I've always been comfortable with it, and it's taken plenty of deer over the years. The first hour passed uneventfully. I saw a few squirrels, a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, but no deer. As the afternoon wore on, the forest began to darken earlier than I expected. Heavy clouds had moved in, making it seem closer to evening than it actually was. Still, visibility was good, and I wasn't concerned. That's when I heard it for the first time. A low, strange sound, coming from somewhere down the ridge to my right, maybe a quarter-mile away. It's hard to describe accurately. The closest comparison I can make is a deep belch or guttural grunt, but that doesn't quite capture it. It was lower, more resonant than any animal call I'm familiar with, and it came at regular intervals. Grunt, pause, grunt, pause. At first I didn't think much of it. Strange sounds in the woods are common enough. Could be a bear, could be some weird echo effect from a more familiar animal. I kept my attention on the game trails below me, figuring whatever it was would either move on or reveal itself eventually. But then I noticed the sound was getting louder, not dramatically but steadily, which meant whatever was making it was moving, and moving in my direction. That's when I started paying closer attention. The grunts were still coming at regular intervals, but now I could feel them almost as much as hear them, a deep, resonant quality that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I shifted position slightly, turning toward the sound, trying to peer through the dense pines that covered that section of the ridge. The light was getting worse by the minute as the clouds thickened overhead, and the pine stand was dark even in good conditions. I couldn't see anything moving, but the sound was definitely getting closer. Then it stopped. Complete silence fell over the forest, not just the strange grunting, but all sound. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling leaves. Nothing. That silence hit me like a physical force. Any hunter knows that sudden silence in the woods usually means one thing: a predator is moving through. I sat completely still, barely breathing, my rifle now pointed in the direction where I'd last heard the sound. For maybe 2 minutes, nothing happened. The forest remained frozen in that unnatural silence. I remember thinking maybe whatever it was had winded me and moved off. Then the cracking started. From the top of the ridge, about 50 yards above and to my right, came the unmistakable sound of breaking branches. Not small twigs, but substantial limbs snapping with sharp, explosive cracks. Whatever was moving up there was big, and it wasn't making any effort to move quietly. Crack, pause, crack, like it was deliberately breaking branches as it moved. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I raised my rifle, looking through the scope toward the sounds, but the pine cover was too thick to see anything clearly, just dark shapes and shadows between the trunks. The breaking branches continued, moving parallel to my position now, neither approaching nor retreating, but keeping to the dense cover at the top of the ridge. I realized with a chill that whatever it was moving on 2 feet. The rhythm of the breaks was all wrong for a 4-legged animal. This was bipedal movement, deliberate, powerful steps that just happened to be snapping branches with each footfall. I've encountered bears, coyotes, bobcats, and every other predator native to Pennsylvania, and none of them move like what I was hearing. Bears might stand on hind legs briefly, but they don't walk that way for any distance. This was something walking upright through the forest with enough weight to snap branches that would support a grown man. The movement continued for several minutes, always just out of clear sight, always in the thickest cover. I caught glimpses of something dark moving between trees, but never a clear view, just the impression of something large shifting through the shadows. The forest around me remained eerily silent, as if every living creature was holding its breath. Then, for just a second, I saw movement at the edge of the pine stand. Something dark moving behind the last row of trees before the forest opened up slightly. I caught it in my scope, a section of what looked like dark fur or hair visible between two trunks. Not a bear's fur. This was longer, shaggier, and then it was gone, moving back into thicker cover. That brief glimpse hit me with a wave of primal fear, unlike anything I've experienced before. There was something calculating in how this thing was moving, keeping to cover, paralleling my position, never quite revealing itself but making sure I knew it was there. This wasn't random animal movement. This felt deliberate, intelligent, almost like stalking behavior. For the next 10 minutes, I sat frozen in place, rifle ready, ears straining for any sound. The breaking branches had stopped, but occasionally I'd hear a soft shuffle from the ridgetop, subtle movements, like something large shifting its weight. It was still up there, watching, waiting. I've never felt more exposed, more vulnerable than in those minutes. The sensation of being observed by something unseen, something that seemed to be intentionally circling my position while staying just out of sight. It was overwhelming. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but my experience as a hunter told me that running would be the worst possible reaction. Eventually, I made the decision to retreat. Dad was waiting in the meadow below, and the thought of him sitting there, unaware of what was moving through these woods, galvanized me to action. I stood slowly, keeping my rifle pointed toward where I'd last heard movement, and began backing away down the slope. I moved as quietly as I could, stepping carefully, constantly scanning the ridgeline above me. Nothing crashed through the woods after me. No roars or growls followed my retreat. Just that same heavy silence, as if the entire forest was watching me go. The half-mile back to the meadow was the longest walk of my life. I didn't run, but I moved quickly, constantly fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. Something deep and instinctual told me that turning my back completely would be dangerous, that whatever had been circling me might take that as an invitation to charge. When I finally reached the edge of the meadow and saw Dad still sitting on his log, rifle across his lap, the relief was overwhelming. I approached him trying to appear calmer than I felt, not wanting to alarm him unnecessarily. But he knows me too well. One look at my face and he was on alert. As briefly as I could, I explained what I'd heard and the glimpse I'd caught. Dad listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he nodded once and simply said we should head back to the truck. No questions, no skepticism, just immediate acceptance that we needed to leave. That reaction from my father, a man who spent his entire life in these woods and isn't given to flights of imagination, affected me almost as much as the encounter itself. He believed me instantly, and something in his eyes told me this might not be the first time he'd heard of such things in these woods. We hiked out together, moving at a pace just short of rushing, neither of us looking back toward the ridge. The forest around us seemed to press in closer with each step, the growing darkness making every shadow suspect. I kept my rifle ready the entire way, jumping at every snapped twig or rustled leaf. The truck was exactly as we'd left it, parked at the end of an old logging road about a mile from the meadow. Only when we were inside, with the doors locked and the engine running, did I allow myself to fully process what had happened. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely buckle my seatbelt. On the drive home, Dad was quieter than usual, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. Finally, about halfway back, he told me something he'd never shared before. In the 40-plus years he'd been hunting these woods, he'd had two similar experiences. Unexplained sounds, the sensation of being watched, glimpses of something large moving just out of clear sight. He'd never told anyone, not even my mother, because he had no way to explain what he'd encountered. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those branches breaking, felt that sensation of being circled by something intelligent and powerful. I kept thinking about how deliberate its movements had been, how it seemed to be letting me know it was there without fully revealing itself. In the 3 years since, I've done a lot of research. I've read accounts from other hunters in Pennsylvania, especially in the Clearfield County area. I found descriptions of similar encounters, strange vocalizations, breaking branches, the sense of being stalked by something that stays just out of sight. Many of these stories come from experienced outdoorsmen with no reason to fabricate such experiences. I've gone back to those woods since then, but never alone, and never to that specific ridge. Something fundamental changed for me that day, a certainty that there are things in the wilderness that defy conventional explanation, things that move with intelligence and purpose, observing us even as we think we're the observers. I don't know what was stalking me on that ridge in Clearfield County. I don't have a name for it that doesn't sound ridiculous when said out loud, but I know what I experienced. The sounds, the glimpse of something large and dark moving with bipedal, intelligent purpose, the overwhelming sensation of being hunted by something that knew exactly what it was doing. And I know that sometimes, when I'm in the woods now, I feel that same watchful presence. I hear branches breaking in patterns too deliberate to be random. I sense something just beyond the limit of my vision, moving parallel to my path, always in the thickest cover, observing but never quite revealing itself. The forest feels different to me now, deeper, older, filled with secrets that might be better left undiscovered. And when darkness falls and the woods go silent, I remember that day on the ridge, the sound of heavy footsteps circling my position, and the absolute certainty that whatever was watching me from the shadows was deciding whether to reveal itself or remain hidden. I think I was lucky it chose to remain hidden. Some confrontations are better left to the imagination than experienced firsthand. Story 11. The dark figure that crossed our field. It's been more than 40 years since that summer day in 1978, but the memory still gives me chills. I was 16 at the time, and our family had a small farm in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. Nothing fancy, a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound deck, a barn for the horses, a few fields, and woods that backed up to state forest land. We weren't serious farmers, just had enough animals and space to be mostly self-sufficient. That afternoon in July was hot and sticky, the kind of summer heat that makes everything move in slow motion. I was sitting on the deck with our dog, a mixed breed, part Labrador, part German Shepherd, who we'd had since I was 12. He was the perfect farm dog, protective, smart, and completely fearless when it came to chasing off raccoons or stray coyotes. I'd never seen him back down from anything. My parents had gone into town for supplies, leaving me to keep an eye on things. It was around 4 in the afternoon, that time of day when the shadows start to get longer, but there's still plenty of daylight left. I remember I was reading a magazine, half paying attention to the dog lying at my feet, enjoying the slight breeze that occasionally broke through the heat. Our property sloped downward from the house toward a line of dense woods about 300 yards away. The main field was where we kept the horses during the day, 3 of them, all quarter horses that my mum had raised from foals. They were grazing peacefully at the far end of the field, near where it met the tree line. It was completely normal, completely quiet. Nothing to suggest what was about to happen. The first sign that something was wrong came from the horses. One moment they were calmly grazing, heads down. The next, all 3 had their heads up, ears forward, completely alert. Then without any warning, they bolted, all 3 at once, running full speed toward the barn as if something had terrified them. I could hear them snorting even from that distance, the sound of pure animal panic. Before I could even stand up to see what had spooked them, our dog went rigid beside me. The fur on his back and neck stood straight up, and he let out a low, rumbling growl that I'd never heard from him before. This wasn't his normal alert bark for a delivery person or even his warning growl for a coyote. This was different, deeper, more primal. I looked down at him, startled by the change, and that's when he launched himself off the deck. He didn't use the stairs, just vaulted over the railing and hit the ground running like a missile aimed at whatever had scared the horses. But he wasn't barking as he ran. He maintained that same low, continuous growl, which somehow made it more disturbing. That's when I finally looked toward the woods, following the path of the dog. And what I saw there froze the blood in my veins. At the edge of the tree line, where the field met the forest, something large and dark was moving. Not emerging cautiously or hiding in the shadows, it was running upright, on two legs, across the open field. Even from that distance, I could tell it was huge, taller than any person I'd ever seen, with a massive chest and unnaturally long arms. Its stride was what struck me most. These powerful, ground-eating steps that covered more distance than should have been possible. It wasn't running like a person runs. Each stride was too long, too fluid, eating up the ground with an efficiency that didn't seem human. And it was fast. Faster than our dog, who was no slouch when it came to speed. I stood up, knocking over my chair, unable to process what I was seeing. This thing, whatever it was crossing our field in broad daylight. It had a dark, almost black appearance, not clothing, but what looked like hair or fur covering its entire body. The sun caught it sometimes as it moved, giving glimpses of mass and muscle underneath that covering. Pure instinct took over, and I shouted. It wasn't words, just a reflexive yell of shock and fear. The sound carried across the field, and the effect was immediate. The figure changed direction. It made this fluid, unnervingly graceful turn and angled toward the tree line on the eastern edge of our property, where the woods were thickest. Our dog was still charging toward it, but he'd never catch up. The creature reached the trees and disappeared into them with one final powerful stride. No crashing sounds, no breaking branches. It just melted into the forest as if it belonged there. The dog skidded to a stop at the exact spot where it had entered the woods. He didn't follow it in. Instead, he stood there, hackles raised, still growling, but making no move to pursue. That's when I felt a new wave of fear wash over me. Our dog, who would chase anything, who had cornered black bears and faced down a bull once, refused to follow this thing into the trees. I was still standing frozen on the deck when my parents' truck pulled up about 20 minutes later. They found me in the same spot, pale and shaking. My dad immediately noticed something was wrong and grabbed his shotgun from the truck before approaching me. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist, something your brain can't quite categorize? Eventually, I managed to get across enough of what happened that my dad decided to investigate. He, my mom, and I walked down the slope toward where I'd seen the figure enter the woods. Our dog rejoined us, staying unusually close to my side, his behavior still tense and alert. We got about halfway down the hill when I noticed something strange about the air. It's hard to explain if you haven't experienced it, but there was a quality to the atmosphere that felt empty, like the natural sounds and smells of the place had been temporarily displaced by something else. Not a smell exactly, though there was a faint musky odor unlike anything I recognized. It was more a feeling, a heavy, watchful silence that pressed against your ears. My dad must have felt it too, because he stopped advancing and held his shotgun a little tighter. "Let's head back," he said, his voice deliberately casual, but with an edge I recognized. He wasn't taking chances, and that scared me more than anything. My dad wasn't the type to spook easily. That night, as we sat at the kitchen table, I started connecting events that I hadn't previously linked together. There was a creek that ran through the back of our property, deep in the woods. A few times over the past year, we'd heard strange sounds coming from that area, breaking branches that sounded like gunshots, the crash of what seemed like entire trees being knocked down. Once, it sounded like something massive had been thrown into the water with enough force to make a splash we could hear from the house. My parents had dismissed these incidents as falling trees, or perhaps bears knocking things around. But after what I'd seen that day, I wasn't so sure. The figure that crossed our field moved with intelligence and purpose. It wasn't a bear, It wasn't a person in a costume, and it had been close to our home, watching, perhaps, before deciding to cross that open space for reasons I couldn't fathom. I remembered another incident from earlier that summer that suddenly made more sense. We had an old well on the property, about a quarter-mile into the woods. It wasn't used anymore, but my friends and I would sometimes hike out there to hang out. One afternoon, we'd been sitting around the stone well when the woods around us went completely silent. That same heavy, oppressive silence I'd felt today. Then the cracking started. Violent, explosive sounds of wood breaking coming from just beyond our sightline. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it, almost like communication. We'd run all the way back to the house that day, and none of us had gone back to the well since. What crossed our field that day in '78 wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal. It was something else, something that moved with both power and intelligence. Something that had been in those woods long before we built our house. Something that occasionally revealed itself before slipping back into the shadows. The horses wouldn't go to that side of the field for weeks afterward. They'd stop at an invisible boundary and refuse to cross, no matter how we tried to lead them. Our dog became more vigilant, spending hours staring into the woods from the deck, his attention focused on that same section of trees where the figure had disappeared. My parents never fully accepted what I'd seen. They didn't deny it outright. They'd seen my face, my terror, the reaction of the animals, but they found ways to file it away, to categorize it as something explainable. A bear, perhaps, or an unusually tall hiker who'd gotten lost and was cutting across our property. But I knew better. The way it moved, the proportions of its body, the effect it had on animals that were used to every normal predator in those woods. This was something different, something that didn't fit into the neat categories of known Pennsylvania wildlife. In the weeks that followed, I found myself watching the tree line constantly, especially in the evenings as the light faded. Sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of movement just inside the forest edge, a shadow that was darker than the others, shifting slightly, a sense of being observed from just beyond the reach of clear visibility. One evening, about 2 weeks after the incident, I was collecting the mail from our roadside mailbox when I heard something that stopped me cold. From deep in the woods came a sound I can only describe as wood hitting wood. 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced, loud enough to carry across hundreds of yards of forest, then silence. Then 3 more knocks from a slightly different direction, as if in response. I ran back to the house, mail forgotten, that same primal fear rising in my chest, because somehow I knew, without being told, that those sounds were communication, that whatever I'd seen crossing our field wasn't alone in those woods. We moved away from that property the following year. My parents said it was because my dad got a better job in another county, and maybe that was part of it. But I always wondered if those repeated incidents, the sounds from the creek, the thing that drove us from the well, the figure crossing our field in broad daylight, had contributed to their decision. I've spent years researching similar encounters since then. There are more reports from Clearfield County than you might expect. Stories of strange sounds, glimpsed figures, animals reacting with unexplained terror. Most people keep these experiences to themselves, afraid of ridicule or disbelief. I understand why. It's easier to doubt yourself, to find rational explanations, than to accept that something exists outside our comfortable categories of known and understood creatures. But I know what I saw that summer day in '78. I know the effect it had on animals that were familiar with every normal predator in those Pennsylvania woods. I know the feeling of that heavy silence that seems to precede these encounters, the sense of a presence that watches and waits, revealing itself only when it chooses to. Those woods in Clearfield County hold secrets, things that move through the shadows, that occasionally cross open fields with long, ground-eating strides, that communicate with wood knocks and tree breaks, that instill a primal fear in both animals and humans. things that were there long before us and will remain long after we're gone. I don't go hiking alone anymore. I don't camp in isolated areas. And when I'm in the woods and the birds suddenly go silent, when that heavy, watchful feeling descends, I don't stick around to see what might emerge from the trees. Some knowledge changes you forever, makes you realize that human beings aren't the only intelligent presence in these forests, and some things are better glimpsed only briefly before they return to the shadows where they belong. Story 12. At the Hands on the Branches. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. When it happened, I was 12 years old, living in rural Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. It was the summer of 1996, and that day changed how I see the woods forever. Even now, 25 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Our house was about 2 miles up a dirt road that wound through dense forest. We were the last house on the road, with nothing but woods and old logging trails beyond. As a kid, I spent most of my time exploring those woods, riding my bike along the dirt roads and trails that crisscrossed the area. My parents gave me a lot of freedom, as long as I was home before dark. That day was a perfectly normal Tuesday in early August. Hot, but not unbearable, with the kind of clear blue sky that makes you want to be outside. I'd been riding my bike all morning, exploring some of the old logging roads that branched off from our main dirt road. By early afternoon, I was heading back toward home, coasting down a long, gentle slope on the main dirt road. This part of the road had thick forest on both sides, mostly oak and maple with heavy undergrowth. The trees created a kind of tunnel effect, with branches meeting overhead in places, casting dappled shadows across the dirt. I wasn't pedaling, just letting gravity pull me down the slope, enjoying the breeze on my face. My bike was nearly silent, just the soft crunch of tires on packed dirt and the occasional click of the chain. I was about halfway down the slope when something moved in the forest to my right. At first, it was just a flash of movement in my peripheral vision, something dark shifting between trees. My first thought was deer, since they were common in the area. But then it emerged onto the road about 20 yards ahead of me, crossing from right to left. In that first instant, my brain tried to categorize what I was seeing as a bear. It was large, dark-colored, and moved on all fours as it first came out of the trees. But something was immediately wrong about that assessment. Its movements were too fluid, too balanced. And then, as it reached the middle of the road, it rose up, not like a bear rearing on its hind legs, but in one smooth motion that brought it fully upright. What stood in the middle of that dirt road was over 6 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with proportions that were almost but not quite human. The arms were too long, the shoulders too broad, the legs slightly bent at the knees. I was still coasting silently downhill, the momentum carrying me forward as my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The creature hadn't noticed me. It was focused on something across the road, a steep embankment that rose about 15 feet up from the left side of the road before the forest continued. In what seemed like slow motion, I watched as it approached the base of this embankment. Then, in a movement that sent chills through my entire body, it reached up with both arms extended. The hands, and they were definitely hands, not paws, grasped 2 tree branches, one from each of 2 saplings growing on the slope. Those hands are what I remember most vividly. They were large, with visible fingers that were longer than a human's would be, and they gripped those branches with obvious strength and dexterity. Not like an animal grabbing something, but like a person reaching up to pull themselves over a wall, deliberate, coordinated, purposeful. With those branches gripped firmly, the creature pulled its entire body up the embankment in one powerful motion. It was like watching someone do a chin-up, but with enough force to lift its entire body 6 feet up the slope in a single smooth movement. No bear could move like that, no human either, for that matter. As it pulled itself up, I could see the muscles shifting beneath the hair on its back and shoulders. The hair itself was dark, almost black in the shadows, but where the sunlight broke through the trees, I could see reddish highlights, like very dark auburn. It didn't have the uniform look of a bear's fur, but fell in uneven lengths, almost like human hair, but coarser. The creature reached the small, natural ledge halfway up the embankment, then continued up and over the top with the same fluid, powerful movements. The entire crossing, from emerging from the right side of the road to disappearing over the embankment on the left, took maybe 15 seconds total. And in all that time, it never made a sound. No breathing, no snapping twigs, no vocalizations, just silent, efficient movement. It wasn't until the creature disappeared over the top of the embankment that I realized I was still moving forward, still coasting silently downhill on my bike, now only about 30 feet from where it had crossed. And it had never once looked in my direction, never noticed me at all. That's when the true terror hit me. I had been completely exposed in the open, moving directly toward this thing. If it had turned around, if it had noticed me, I would have been mere seconds away from it with no time to escape. I was just a skinny 12-year-old on a bike, and this creature was powerful enough to pull its entire body up a steep slope with just its arms. Pure survival instinct took over. I planted my feet on the ground, skidding to a stop, then turned my bike around so fast I nearly fell over. My heart was hammering in my chest as I started pedaling uphill, back the way I'd come. The grade was steep enough that I had to stand up on the pedals, my legs burning with the effort, but I didn't care. All I wanted was distance between me and whatever I'd just seen. I remember my throat was completely dry, like I'd swallowed dust. I wanted to look back to see if it had returned, if it was following me, but I was too terrified. Some deep instinct told me that looking back would somehow make it worse, would maybe even draw its attention to me if it was watching. So I kept my eyes forward, pedaling harder than I ever had in my life, promising myself I wouldn't look back until I reached the top of the hill. When I finally crested the hill, legs shaking from exertion, I allowed myself one quick glance behind me. The road stretched empty in both directions, no sign of the creature, just the silent, indifferent forest on either side. Somehow, that almost made it worse, the idea that it was still out there, moving through those woods, undetected and unknown. I rode all the way home without stopping, constantly checking over my shoulder. When I got home, I was so shaken that my mom immediately knew something was wrong. When I told her what I'd seen, she tried to convince me it was just a bear. But I knew better. I'd seen bears before. This wasn't that. The image of those hands gripping the branches haunted me for years. They weren't paws. They weren't human hands either. They were something in between, fingers longer than they should be, moving with a dexterity that seemed impossible for something that size. And the way it pulled itself up that embankment in one fluid motion, no bear moves like that. No person either. For weeks afterward, I refused to ride my bike down that road alone. Eventually, as summer turned to fall and then winter, the memory became less immediate, though never less vivid. I started using that road again, but always with a sense of wariness, always scanning the trees on either side. I never saw the creature again, but there were times when I'd be riding through those woods and I'd get a feeling, a prickling on the back of my neck, a sense that I wasn't alone. Sometimes I'd hear branches cracking deep in the forest, too loud to be caused by a squirrel or raccoon. Once, I found a strange track in some mud near a creek, much larger than a human footprint, with 5 distinct toe impressions. I didn't stop to examine it closely. I just pedaled away as fast as I could. As I got older, I researched similar encounters in Pennsylvania. It turns out Clearfield County has a history of strange sightings going back generations. The old-timers in the area had stories they'd tell in hushed voices, experiences in the woods that didn't fit neatly into known wildlife categories. Most were dismissed as tall tales or misidentifications. But after what I saw that day, I'm not so quick to dismiss them. The detail that still gets to me, all these years later, is how close I came without it noticing me. I was completely vulnerable, coasting silently downhill, unable to quickly change direction or escape if it had turned around. The fact that it was so focused on crossing that road, on reaching whatever destination lay beyond that embankment, that it didn't even register my presence, that suggests purpose, intention, a mind focused on specific goals, not random animal behavior. And those hands. The image is burned into my memory, the way they reached up and grasped those branches, fingers wrapping around the wood with obvious intelligence and coordination. The proportions were wrong for a human hand. The fingers too long, the palm too broad, but the functionality was unmistakable. These were appendages designed for grasping, for manipulating objects with precision. I'm 37 now, with children of my own. We don't live in Clearfield County anymore, but sometimes we visit my parents, who still have the same house at the end of that dirt road. I let my kids play in the yard, but I've never let them explore the woods alone the way I did as a child. They think I'm overprotective. Maybe I am. But on our last visit, my 10-year-old daughter came running back from the edge of the yard, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. "Dad," she said, "I heard something big moving in the trees down there." I felt that same cold sensation crawl up my spine, the one I'd felt all those years ago. "What did it sound like?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Like something walking," she said. "But not like a deer, heavier. And it stopped when I got close, like it was listening to me." I called her back into the yard immediately, making up some excuse about lunch being ready soon. As she ran back to the house, I stood at the edge of the property, staring into those same woods that had been the backdrop to my childhood. The same woods where 25 years earlier I'd seen something impossible cross a dirt road and climb an embankment with eerily human-like hands. The forest looked back at me, silent and ancient, and somewhere in those shadows I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something that had been there long before we built our houses and laid our roads, something that would remain long after we were gone. I still don't know what I saw that day. I don't have a name for it that doesn't sound ridiculous when said out loud. But I know what I witnessed was real. Those hands gripping the branches, the fluid way it pulled itself up that slope, the reddish highlights in its dark hair when the sun hit it just right. These weren't details my 12-year-old imagination could have invented. Whatever it was, it shares these woods with us, moving silently just beyond the edges of our awareness, crossing our paths only rarely, and it seems usually by accident. The thought that keeps me up sometimes is how many times I might have been close to one without knowing it, how many times I might have been watched from the trees while thinking I was alone. The woods of Clearfield County hold secrets. I glimpsed one of them briefly on a summer day when I was 12 years old. And though I've tried to convince myself otherwise over the years, I know that what I saw was something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably does. Story 13. What crossed between the trees. I still remember every detail of that day, even though it happened 24 years ago. I was 11 years old, growing up in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. Our house was on the edge of a pretty big stretch of woods with a creek running through it about a quarter mile from our backyard. That creek was my favorite place in the world. That summer, I'd gotten really into drawing. Not anything fancy, just sketching trees, rocks, little critters, whatever caught my eye. My parents were okay with me going to the creek alone as long as I was back by dinner. It wasn't considered dangerous. This was rural Pennsylvania in the 90s, and every kid I knew had their own special outdoor spot. It was a Tuesday in late July, hot but not unbearable, with that heavy summer stillness where even the insects seemed too lazy to make much noise. I'd packed my sketchbook, some colored pencils, and a peanut butter sandwich in my backpack. I remember I was wearing my favorite jean shorts, a blue t-shirt with some cartoon character on it, and these beat-up sneakers that were perfect for creek walking. The path to the creek was well worn. I'd walked it hundreds of times. It wound through the woods, down a gentle slope, until it opened up to a small clearing where the creek bent around a cluster of smooth rocks. That's where I always sat. The rocks formed a natural seat, and I could dangle my feet in the water while I drew. I'd been there for maybe an hour, just sketching and occasionally munching on my sandwich. The creek wasn't very wide, maybe 10 feet across at its widest point, but it had these crystal clear pools where you could see all the way to the bottom. I was trying to draw the way sunlight filtered through the trees and dappled the water. Nothing special, just a peaceful afternoon doing what I loved. Then everything got quiet. I mean completely unnaturally quiet. If you've spent time in the woods, you know there's always some background noise. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, insects buzzing. But suddenly all of that just stopped. It was like someone had pressed mute on the entire forest. Even the creek seemed to be flowing more quietly, though I know that's impossible. At first, I didn't think much of it. Sometimes a hawk would fly over, and the smaller creatures would go silent. But this silence felt different, heavier, more complete. I remember looking up from my sketchbook and feeling suddenly aware of how alone I was. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from the slope to my right, up where the forest got thicker. Heavy, deliberate steps with a distinct pattern. One step, a pause, another step. Like someone trying to walk quietly, but too heavy to succeed. The sound was unmistakable, the soft crunch of dry leaves and twigs under significant weight. I froze, my pencil hovering above my sketchbook. My first thought was that it might be a deer, but I knew instantly that wasn't right. Deer don't walk with that rhythm. They're lighter, quicker, more delicate in their movements. This was something big, moving slowly and deliberately. The steps continued, getting slightly louder, which meant whatever was making them was moving closer to the creek. I turned my head toward the sound, my heart beginning to thump hard against my ribs. That's when I saw it. On the slope above the creek, maybe 30 yards away, a dark figure crossed between two trees. It was moving in a diagonal path, not directly toward me, but on a trajectory that would take it further along the creek. The thing that immediately struck me was that it was walking completely upright, not hunched, not on all fours, upright, like a person, but with proportions that were all wrong. Even from that distance, I could tell it was huge. The shoulders were impossibly wide, giving its upper body a triangular appearance. It moved with this strange, controlled rhythm that didn't match any animal I'd ever seen. Each step was deliberate, careful, and weirdly silent for something so large. There was no crashing through underbrush, no snapping of major branches, just those soft footfalls I'd heard. The whole sighting probably lasted only 5 or 6 seconds before it disappeared behind a curve in the terrain. But in those seconds, several details burned themselves into my memory. The long arms that hung lower than a person's would, the dark color, not black, more like a very dark brown, and the smooth, controlled gait. It wasn't running or hurrying. It was just walking, like it belonged there. What scared me most wasn't that it might be coming for me. It clearly wasn't headed in my direction. What terrified me was the naturalness of it. This thing existed in these woods. It moved through them with the confidence of something that knew every tree, every rock, every bend in the creek, and I had never known it was there. For maybe 10 seconds after it disappeared, I sat completely still, my body locked in place by a fear more profound than anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the fear of being chased or attacked. It was the fear of having the world you thought you understood completely upended. These woods that I'd played in my entire childhood suddenly felt alien and unknown. When I could finally move again, I carefully closed my sketchbook and put it in my backpack, along with my sandwich and pencils. I remember being extremely deliberate about it, moving slowly and quietly, as if making a sudden noise might draw its attention back to me. I didn't run. Something deep inside told me that running would be a mistake. So I walked, quickly but quietly, back the way I'd come, constantly looking over my shoulder. The entire hike home, the woods remained eerily silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just my own careful footsteps and the thunder of my heartbeat in my ears. I kept expecting to see that dark figure again, maybe following me, maybe watching from between the trees. But I saw nothing, which somehow was worse than seeing it again. At least if I could see it, I'd know where it was. When I got home, I didn't tell my parents. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they'd forbid me from going to the creek again. Instead, I went to my room and tried to draw what I'd seen, but the proportions never came out right. The shoulders were never wide enough, the arms never long enough. No matter how I tried, I couldn't capture the fluid, controlled movement that had looked so unnatural, yet so perfectly adapted to the forest. I did go back to the creek eventually, but never alone again, and never to that exact spot. Something fundamental had changed in my relationship with those woods. The comfortable familiarity was gone, replaced by a constant awareness that I wasn't the only one moving through that landscape, that something else was there too, something that moved quietly and watched carefully. As I grew older, I started researching similar encounters in Clearfield County. I was surprised by how many there were, dozens of reports spanning decades, many from credible sources who had nothing to gain from sharing their experiences. The descriptions varied in specifics, but certain details remained consistent. The wide shoulders, the long arms, the controlled movement, the to move through dense forest with minimal sound. What struck me most about these other accounts was the emotional similarity, that same sense of fundamental unease that I'd felt. Not fear of attack, but fear of something more existential. The realization that the world contains things we don't understand, things that exist alongside us but separate, watching from just beyond the edges of our awareness. I'm 35 now, with a life and career far from those Pennsylvania woods, but I've never forgotten what I saw that day, and I've never stopped looking for answers. Sometimes, when I'm hiking or camping in other forests, I'll get a feeling. A prickle on the back of my neck, a sudden silence falling around me. And I'll wonder if the thing I saw at the creek is unique to Clearfield County, or if its kind exists in woodlands throughout the country, moving quietly between the trees, observing but rarely seen. The rational part of my brain has spent years trying to explain it away. Maybe it was a bear walking briefly on its hind legs. Maybe it was a person in dark clothing, distorted by distance and the fear of a child alone in the woods. Maybe it was nothing more than a trick of light and shadow, a momentary misperception magnified by memory and time. But I know what I saw. I know the unnatural silence that preceded it. I know the controlled, deliberate way it moved. I know the cold certainty I felt in that moment, that I was glimpsing something that wasn't supposed to exist, or at least wasn't supposed to be seen. The creek is still there. The woods are still there. My parents still live in the same house. When I visit them, I sometimes stand at the edge of the tree line in their backyard, looking toward where the creek winds through the forest. I never venture that far anymore. But sometimes, in the early morning or late evening, when the light is dim and the shadows are long, I think I catch glimpses of movement deep among the trees, something large shifting between trunks, something that knows how to stay just out of clear sight. I've heard other people from Clearfield talk about similar experiences in hushed tones, not the kind of stories people tell to get attention or to entertain at parties. These are the quiet confessions shared only with those who might understand, who might not immediately dismiss or ridicule. Because that's the thing about encounters like mine. They change you. They create a divide between those who know and those who don't. They make you question everything you thought you understood about the world around you. The forests of Clearfield County hold secrets. Most people live their entire lives without glimpsing them, walking trails and fishing creeks in blissful ignorance of what might be watching from just beyond the next ridge. Sometimes I envy them that innocence. But once you've seen what I saw, once you've felt the weight of that silent observation, that ancient presence, you can never fully return to not knowing. I still draw sometimes, trees, creeks, the natural world, but I always leave spaces between the trees, dark gaps where the eye can't quite penetrate. Because that's the truth of the forest that 11-year-old me discovered on that summer day. We never see it all. There are always shadows, always spaces between, always places where something can move unseen, watching and waiting as we pass through what we mistakenly believe is empty space. Whatever crossed between those trees that day, it belongs to the woods in a way we never will. It knows how to move there, how to remain hidden, how to watch without being watched in return. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right, when a young girl sits alone by a creek, absorbed in her drawing, it allows itself to be glimpsed just for a moment, before disappearing back into the shadows where it has always lived. Story 14. The small creature at Speedwell. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. What happened to me last June still doesn't make sense, and I'm not the type of person who believes in cryptids or monsters or whatever. I'm a pretty practical guy. I work in IT, I like hiking and photography, normal stuff. But what I saw that day at Franklin Parker Preserve has been keeping me up at night, and I need to get it off my chest. It was June 20th, 2019. I remember the exact date because I had taken the day off work, specifically to scout some photography locations in the Pine Barrens. It was a Thursday, perfect weather, sunny around 75 degrees, not too humid for New Jersey in June. I'd spent the morning exploring a few trails and was driving south on Route 563, just cruising with the windows down, enjoying the scenery. I hadn't planned to stop at Franklin Parker Preserve that day. I was actually heading to another spot, but as I was driving, I noticed the Speedwell entrance to the preserve on my right. I'd heard it was a good spot for wildlife photography, especially birds, so I decided to pull over and check it out. Nothing planned, just a spontaneous detour. I parked in the small gravel lot and was getting my camera gear together when something caught my eye across the road. The area opposite the Speedwell entrance is mostly scrubby pines and underbrush. Not particularly remarkable, but there was something small moving along the edge of the vegetation, maybe 30 yards from where I stood. At first glance, I thought it was a child. The height was right, maybe 3 feet tall or so, about 1 to 1.1 meters. But something immediately felt off about the movement. It wasn't running or walking like a kid would. The motion was more deliberate, cautious almost, like it was moving with intense awareness of its surroundings. I put my camera down in the car and decided to get a closer look. I crossed the road, thinking maybe someone's kid had wandered off from a family hiking in the preserve. As I got within about 30 yards, the figure turned toward me, and that's when I realized I wasn't looking at a child. The thing standing there was small, yes, but its proportions were all wrong for a human child. Its head seemed slightly larger relative to its body, and its limbs were thinner but not in a malnourished way. More like they were naturally more slender. But what really hit me was the face. Its eyes were enormous, easily twice the size of human eyes relative to its face, and a deep, dark brown color. The most unsettling part was that there was no white visible in the eyes at all, just those large, dark orbs that seemed to be taking in everything. The face itself had no hair, a small nose, and a mouth that seemed slightly wider than a human's would be. The skin on its face was a grayish tan color. Not quite human-looking, but not radically alien either. I froze in place, my brain struggling to categorize what I was seeing. The creature and I just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. I noticed its hands and feet were also bare of fur, showing the same grayish tan skin as its face. But the rest of its body was covered in short, golden-colored fur that reminded me exactly of a golden retriever. That same warm gold shade that almost seems to glow in sunlight. My mind was racing, trying to make this make sense. A monkey? No, we don't have wild monkeys in New Jersey. A child in some kind of costume. The fur looked too natural, too integrated with the skin. A dog standing on its hind legs. No way, the posture was completely upright and bipedal. While my brain was short-circuiting trying to process what I was seeing, the creature continued to stare at me with those huge dark eyes. There was something in that gaze that I still can't adequately describe, a kind of intelligence or awareness that felt deeply unsettling, not aggressive or threatening, but definitely not animal-like either. It felt like being studied. Then, without warning, it moved. And this is where things get even stranger. The creature suddenly darted to its right, toward a marshy area at the edge of the woods. Its movement was incredibly fast, not like a human running, more like how a lizard can go from completely still to full sprint in a fraction of a second. One moment it was standing there, the next it was a golden blur of motion. It disappeared behind a small bush about 20 yards away. The whole thing happened so quickly that I barely had time to register the movement. I stood there, stunned, for a good 30 seconds, just staring at the bush where it had vanished. Then, cautiously, I moved closer to where I'd last seen it. This is the part that really freaks me out when I think back on it. When I reached the bush, there was nothing. No tracks in the soft ground, no disturbed vegetation, no sound of something moving away through the underbrush. It was as if the creature had simply ceased to exist the moment it went behind that bush. The marsh beyond was open enough that I should have been able to see it if it had continued running. The water was still, with no ripples to suggest something had entered it. The mud showed no footprints. It had completely vanished. I spent nearly an hour searching the area, looking for any sign of the creature, any evidence that what I'd seen was real. I took photos of the area, thinking maybe I'd capture something I hadn't noticed. Later, when I reviewed those photos, there was nothing unusual in any of them, just brush, marsh, and pine trees. The logical part of my brain kept trying to come up with explanations. Maybe it was someone's exotic pet that had escaped. Maybe it was a child with some kind of condition that affected their appearance, though that wouldn't explain the fur or the impossible way it moved and disappeared. Eventually, I gave up searching and went back to my car. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes, dark, intelligent, and somehow ancient-looking despite the creature's small size. And I couldn't explain how something could disappear so completely in an open landscape. I decided to drive around to some of the other entrances of the preserve, thinking maybe I'd run into a park ranger or someone I could ask if there had been any other strange sightings. I spent the rest of the afternoon driving up and down Route 563, stopping at every parking area and trailhead, but the few people I encountered were just normal hikers and birdwatchers. I didn't mention what I'd seen. How could I without sounding completely insane? As the day wore on, I found myself becoming increasingly unsettled. It wasn't just what I'd seen that was bothering me, it was the feeling that came with it. There had been something profoundly wrong about the encounter, something that didn't fit into my understanding of the world. It was like suddenly discovering a door in your house that you'd never noticed before, one that shouldn't exist based on the floor plan. It made me question everything else I thought I knew. When I got home that evening, I immediately started researching. I looked into known wildlife in the Pine Barrens. Nothing remotely close to what I'd seen. I searched for reports of escaped exotic pets in the area. Nothing. I even dove into local folklore, wondering if there was some Pine Barrens legend I hadn't heard of. Something besides the famous Jersey Devil that might explain what I'd encountered. What I found instead were a handful of similar reports from the Chatsworth area over the years. Most were vague. Small humanoid creature, child-sized being with unusual eyes. But a few contained details that matched what I'd seen with unsettling accuracy. One report from 2003 described a small golden-furred creature with big dark eyes, seen near a cranberry bog not far from the Parker Preserve. Another from 2015 mentioned a small upright figure that moved impossibly fast in the same general area. These reports were scattered and rare, buried in obscure forums and local interest websites. Not the kind of thing that makes the news or attracts serious attention, but they were enough to convince me that I wasn't the first to see whatever this was. In the weeks that followed, I went back to the Speedwell entrance 3 more times, always with my camera ready. I never saw the creature again, but on my second visit, I experienced something strange. I was standing near the same spot where the encounter had occurred when all the birds in the area suddenly went silent. The Pine Barrens are never completely quiet. There's always some bird calling, some insect buzzing, but for about 2 minutes there was absolute silence. Then, from the direction of the marsh, I heard a soft rustling sound, like something small moving through vegetation. I pointed my camera toward the sound, but saw nothing. When I checked the photos later, there was one frame with what might have been a blur of movement, but it was too indistinct to make out any details. It's been almost a year now, and I still think about that encounter almost daily. I've become somewhat obsessed with the Pine Barrens, spending weekends exploring different areas, always with my camera, always hoping for another glimpse of whatever it was. I've joined online groups dedicated to unusual sightings in the region. I've talked to locals, though I'm careful about how much I reveal of my own experience. Most people are dismissive, but occasionally someone will get a look in their eyes that tells me they've seen something too, something they can't explain. The thing that continues to haunt me isn't just the physical appearance of the creature, strange as it was. It's the sense I had, in that moment when our eyes met, that I was looking at something that understood me far better than I understood it. Those eyes held a kind of knowing that made me feel transparent, like it could see right through me to something I couldn't see myself. And then there's the way it disappeared, not just running away, but seeming to vanish completely from a relatively open area. I've replayed that moment in my mind hundreds of times, trying to figure out how it could have disappeared so thoroughly, so instantaneously. The only explanation I can come up with is one that my rational mind refuses to accept, that it somehow wasn't bound by the same physical laws that govern everything else in our world. I've read scientific papers about undiscovered species, about how even in a place as densely populated as New Jersey, there could still be unknown creatures living in the vast stretches of the Pine Barrens. The preserve itself covers over 9,000 acres, and it connects to other protected forests and wetlands. In theory, something could live there, hidden from human eyes most of the time. But that doesn't explain what I saw. The golden fur, the oversized eyes, the way it moved and vanished, none of that fits with any known animal. And the intelligence I sensed behind those eyes wasn't animal intelligence. It was something else entirely. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't believe in the supernatural or in monsters hiding in the woods, or at least I didn't before June 20th, 2019. Now, I'm not so sure. Now, when I walk in the woods, I find myself constantly scanning the underbrush, looking for a flash of golden fur or the gleam of oversized dark eyes. I find myself listening for sudden silences, for the absence of normal forest sounds that might signal something unusual is present. I don't know what I encountered that day at the Speedwell entrance. I don't have a name for it or a category to put it in. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it chose to reveal itself to me for reasons I may never understand. And somewhere in the Pine Barrens, in the swamps and forests around Chatsworth, it's still there, watching, waiting, perfectly adapted to a landscape where it can appear and disappear like a mirage, leaving those who encounter it questioning their own senses and sanity. I'll be going back to Franklin Parker Preserve next week, same date, June 20th. 1 year exactly since the encounter. I don't expect to see the creature again. Lightning rarely strikes twice, but I feel compelled to return, to stand in that same spot and remember the moment when my understanding of the world changed forever. Because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, you can never truly go back to not knowing. You can only move forward, carrying that knowledge with you, forever searching for answers that might never come. Story 15. What stalked us in the Pine Barrens? I've always been fascinated by reptiles. Since I was a kid, I've spent countless hours tracking, photographing, and documenting snakes in their natural habitats. It's a weird hobby, I know, but it's led me to some amazing places over the years. It's also led me to one experience that I still can't explain, even 3 years later. It happened in June of 2019. I'd been planning a research trip to the Pine Barrens in New Jersey for months. If you're not familiar with the Pine Barrens, it's this massive stretch of pine forest and wetlands covering over 1 million acres in southern New Jersey. It's one of the largest undeveloped areas on the East Coast, and it's a gold mine for herpetologists like me. The unique ecosystem is home to several snake species I was particularly interested in studying. I'd mapped out a route that would take me deep into a remote section of the Barrens, far from the typical tourist trails. My plan was to spend a full day searching for specific snake species in a swampy area I'd identified using topographical maps and satellite imagery. The spot looked promising because it featured several dry, sandy ridges surrounded by wetlands, perfect snake habitat. I arrived at the trailhead around 7 in the morning. The day was already warm, promising to be one of those humid June days where you're soaked in sweat within minutes. I packed light, just my camera gear, field notebook, water, some trail mix, and basic survival essentials. The hike-in was supposed to be about 3 miles, following game trails and old fire roads, before eventually going off-trail to reach my target area. The first 2 hours were uneventful. The Pine Barrens have this otherworldly quality to them. Stunted pine trees, sandy soil, and an absolute maze of wetlands and streams that can disorient even experienced hikers. The landscape looks almost the same in every direction, and it's easy to see why the place has inspired so many local legends over the years. By around 9:30, I reached the edge of the wetland area I'd identified on the maps. From there, I had to pick my way carefully through the swamp, hopping from one patch of solid ground to another. It was slow, exhausting work. The mosquitoes were relentless, and the heat was building. But I was excited. This was exactly the type of remote terrain where I might find some of the rarer snake species I was after. After another 30 minutes of slogging through the swamp, I spotted what I was looking for. A long, narrow ridge of dry land, rising like an island in the middle of the wetland. From my research, I knew these ridges were often prime basking spots for snakes. I made my way toward it, occasionally sinking ankle-deep in muck, but eventually reached the base of the ridge. It wasn't very high, maybe 15 feet above the surrounding swamp, but it stretched for a couple hundred yards, covered with scrubby pines and oak trees. There was an old deer stand or hunting blind at one end, probably abandoned years ago. The structure was weathered and tilting to one side, but it looked like it would offer a good vantage point for surveying the area. I climbed the ridge and made my way to the hunting blind. The wood creaked under my weight as I climbed the few steps up to the platform. From there, I had a clear view of the surrounding wetlands. The morning sun was creating a slight mist over the water, giving the whole scene this primeval feel. I took out my camera and started scanning the area, looking for any movement that might indicate snakes. For about an hour, I alternated between watching from the blind and carefully exploring the ridge, turning over logs and rocks where snakes might be hiding. I found a few common species, a garter snake and a small ring-necked snake, but not the rare pine snakes or corn snakes I was hoping for. Still, it was peaceful out there, miles from the nearest road or building. Just me and the sounds of the swamp, birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional splash of something moving in the water. That's when I heard it. A deep, low sound coming from somewhere in the swamp below the ridge. At first, I thought it might be a bullfrog, but it was too substantial. The closest thing I can compare it to is a deep belch or grunt, but even that doesn't quite capture it. It was a vocalization of some kind, and it was loud enough to carry clearly across the water. I froze, listening intently. After about 30 seconds, it came again. The same guttural sound. It seemed to be coming from maybe 100 yards away, somewhere in the thick vegetation on the far side of the wetland. My first thought was that it might be a bear, though bears aren't common in this part of the Pine Barrens. Whatever it was big. I stayed completely still, waiting to see if I could hear it again, or maybe catch a glimpse of whatever was making the sound. For several minutes, there was nothing but the normal swamp noises. Then the grunting sound came again, but this time it was closer, maybe 70 yards away now. It was moving toward me. That's when I started to get nervous. I'm not usually scared in the wilderness. I've encountered bears, coyotes, and all sorts of wildlife during my research trips, and I know how to handle myself. But something about this situation felt different. The sound wasn't quite right for any animal I was familiar with, and the way it was methodically moving closer sent a chill down my spine. I decided to retreat to the hunting blind. From there, I could at least have a better view of the surrounding area while staying partially concealed. I climbed back up and crouched down, my camera ready, eyes scanning the edge of the wetland where I'd heard the sounds. The grunting stopped, but then I heard something else. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps moving through the swamp. Not the splashing you'd expect from a four-legged animal, but distinct rhythmic steps. Slow, deliberate, and spaced apart, like something walking on two legs. Thud. Pause. Thud. Pause. Each impact was followed by the sound of water sloshing and vegetation being pushed aside. My heart was racing now. Whatever was out there was big, moving on two legs and coming directly toward the ridge where I was perched. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the sounds. They were coming from the north side of the ridge, maybe 50 yards out now, still hidden by the thick swamp vegetation, but definitely getting closer. Then the footsteps stopped. For a full minute, there was complete silence. Not just the absence of the footsteps, but a total cessation of all swamp sounds. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. The silence was shattered by a sudden, violent cracking sound, like a thick branch being snapped in half. Then another crack, and another. The sounds were coming from the same direction as the footsteps had been, but with more force now. It wasn't the sound of something accidentally breaking branches as it moved. It was deliberate, forceful breaking, almost like a signal or a warning. I was genuinely scared now. I'd never heard anything like this before. My rational mind was struggling to categorize what could be making these sounds. A bear wouldn't move through a swamp on two legs. A human wouldn't make those guttural vocalizations or break branches with that kind of force, and neither would move with that slow, methodical pace. The branch breaking continued for another minute, then stopped. The silence returned, somehow even heavier than before. I waited, my camera clutched tightly, though I'd completely forgotten about taking pictures at this point. I was just watching, listening, trying to control my breathing. That's when I saw movement at the edge of the tree line, about 40 yards from the base of my ridge. Just a shadow at first, something dark moving behind the screen of vegetation. Then it shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something large moving between two trees. It was only visible for a split second, a dark shape, definitely upright, moving with an unnatural smoothness from one tree to another. My blood ran cold. From my elevated position, I could tell this thing was tall, much taller than a person, and it moved with a deliberation that spoke of intelligence. This wasn't random animal movement. It was calculated, careful, as if it was fully aware of my presence and was deliberately staying just out of clear sight. I had a terrible realization. It was circling the ridge. The footsteps had started on the north side, but now the movement was visible on the east side. It was working its way around, methodically checking the perimeter of the high ground where I was hiding. I don't know what made me call out. Fear, maybe, or some desperate hope that revealing my presence might make whatever it was retreat. I stood up in the blind and shouted, "Hey, someone there?" The effect was immediate and terrifying. The movement stopped instantly, not like a startled animal freezing momentarily before bolting. This was a controlled, deliberate cessation of movement, like it was considering my voice, processing the fact that I'd acknowledged its presence. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then, from a slightly different position, now on the southeast corner of the ridge, the branch breaking started again. Crack, 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 loud enough to make me flinch with each sound, but this time it had a rhythm to it, an almost conversational cadence, like it was responding to me. That's when true panic set in. This thing, whatever it was intelligent. It had heard me call out, had processed my words, and was now communicating back in its own way. And it was still circling, still working its way around the ridge, maintaining that same careful distance where it remained just barely visible. I had to get out of there. The ridge had only one easy access point, the same way I'd come up. Every other side dropped off steeply into the swamp. I gathered my gear with shaking hands, almost dropping my camera in the process. The whole time, I kept my eyes on the spot where I'd last seen movement, though there was nothing visible now. I climbed down from the blind and started moving as quickly as I dared toward the end of the ridge where I could descend. The entire time, I felt watched, not just observed, but studied, like whatever was circling was evaluating my movements, my behavior, my reactions. I reached the end of the ridge and looked down at the path I'd need to take through the swamp to get back to the main trail. It meant crossing open water in places, being exposed and vulnerable, but staying on the ridge felt even more dangerous now. As I started to descend, I heard the footsteps again, this time from the opposite side of the ridge, moving parallel to my path. It was keeping pace with me, still hidden by vegetation, but definitely following my movement. The realization that it was tracking me, anticipating my escape route, sent a fresh wave of terror through my body. I half climbed, half slid down the side of the ridge, and hit the swamp at a run, no longer caring about getting wet or dirty. I just needed to get back to the main trail, back to civilization. I splashed through the water, stumbling on the uneven bottom, constantly looking over my shoulder. The thing in the swamp matched my pace. I couldn't see it directly, but I could track its progress by the movement of vegetation and the occasional glimpse of something dark shifting between trees. It stayed about 50 yards away, never closing the distance but never falling behind either. Just following, observing. The trip back through the swamp, which had taken me 30 careful minutes on the way in, I now covered in maybe 10 frantic minutes. My boots were filled with water, my clothes soaked with sweat and marsh water. I reached the edge of the wetland and found the game trail that would lead me back to the main path, relief flooding through me at the sight of more open, drier ground. As I started up the trail, I risked one more look back. And there, at the exact edge of the wetland where it met the higher ground, I saw it clearly for the first and only time. Just for a moment, but enough to cement the image in my memory forever. It was standing partially concealed by a large pine, but its shape was unmistakable. Tall, at least 7 feet, with broad shoulders and a body covered in dark hair or fur. It was bipedal, standing upright with an ease that no bear could match. I couldn't make out facial features at that distance, but I could feel its gaze locked onto me. There was an intelligence in its posture, in the deliberate way it held itself just at the threshold between exposure and concealment. We stared at each other for maybe 3 seconds before I turned and ran up the trail, no longer caring about anything but getting away. I ran until my lungs burned, until the stitch in my side felt like a knife. Only when I reached the main hiking path did I slow to a walk, constantly checking behind me, though I never saw the creature again. The hike back to my car, a distance that had taken me 2 relaxed hours in the morning, I covered in a single hour of panicked hiking. By the time I reached the parking area, my legs were trembling with exhaustion and leftover adrenaline. I sat in my car for a long time, doors locked, trying to process what had happened. What I'd seen in those woods defied logical explanation. The way it moved, the intelligence it displayed, the deliberate nature of its actions, none of it matched any known animal behavior. 2 days later, against my better judgment, I went back. Not all the way to the ridge. I couldn't bring myself to go that far, but to the edge of the wetland. What I found disturbed me even more than the encounter itself. There were trails through the underbrush, wide paths where the vegetation had been pushed aside by something large. And in a few muddy spots, there were depressions that looked like footprints, though not clear enough to make out details. The stride length between them was unnaturally long, like whatever made them could cover 4 to 5 feet in a single step. I haven't gone back to that part of the Pine Barrens since then. I still research snakes, still spend time in the wilderness, but never alone now and never in that particular area. Sometimes I check satellite images of that swamp, looking for changes, for signs that something large is moving through that landscape. I never see anything definitive, but the question haunts me. What was out there that day? What was watching me, tracking me, communicating with me through broken branches and measured footsteps? The Pine Barrens have always been a place of legends and strange stories. After what happened to me, I understand why. Some parts of this world remain truly wild, hiding things that don't fit neatly into our categories of known animals, things that watch from the shadows, that study us as we study them, that choose when to be seen and when to remain hidden. I don't know what circled me on that ridge in the Pine Barrens. I don't have a name for it that doesn't sound ridiculous when said out loud, but I know what I experienced. And I know that sometimes, when I'm in the woods and the birds suddenly go silent, I find myself scanning the trees, listening for that distinctive pattern of slow, deliberate footsteps coming through the undergrowth.